Adriana demanded, whirling around. She felt surprised by the anger at him, but felt it was justified. I'm not so willing to easily give up on them like you. Eric's teal eyes darkened. What are you going to do? Go out there and demand that Genevieve keep dating him. She already thinks the worst, so she'll likely never talk to him again. That's exactly the problem. She doesn't know, Eric. She made assumptions about the whole thing and wouldn't let him explain. She's no doubt told her parents the same convoluted story, so they think the worst, too. Hopefully they have the decency to keep it to themselves, but if it gets out that Finn cheated on his supposed fiancée, Adriana threw up her hands to create quotations. Don't you think that will look bad on him forever? Oh yeah, let's just add some more Haddock drama to the Archiplagan history books, except this one would be founded on a rumor and not actual truth, and I won't stand for it. So answer me this then, Eric said, an edge to his voice that was rarely there. Are you doing this for Finn, or for yourself? Since you brought it up, can you not stand the fact that people might whisper about your family more than they already do, or do you actually care about how this might blow up in Finn's face more than it already has? Adriana stared, the sting of the words hitting deep and true. The dark look cleared from Eric's eyes, instantly replaced with regret. Annie. No, Adriana said in a low voice. I'm not selfishly doing this for myself. I don't care what people think about me, but you already knew that. I care deeply that my brother finally found a girl who loves and accepts him, and the moment she didn't understand something, she cut ties and insulted his character. I will not stand for it. Straightening her spine, Adriana took a deep breath through her nose. So, I will go to Jet in the morning and try to talk some sense into her. And if she persists, then I'll leave it alone. But for my brother, my twin, who has countless times put his neck on the line for me, I will certainly try. With that, Adriana turned away. She didn't make it more than 3 steps before his hand caught her elbow, gentle but firm. Annie. Please, I'm sorry, I don't know where that came from. Words, she said, don't come from nowhere. People tend to say what they really think in their heart. Adriana pulled her elbow out of his hold and went to their room. She closed the door behind her and began changing into comfortable pajamas, warm for the small, drafty house. She'd need to get up early enough to get to Jet at a decent time. Hopefully she wouldn't have to talk to Eric in the morning before she left, but knew she likely would. Whatever the case, she didn't want to talk to him anymore tonight. Selfish. She'd had plenty of selfish moments in her life, but not this. No, her only concern was for her brother. Him, and the friend she'd made in the last year. The sister she'd found. Her eyes burned at the onslaught of memories that came to mind of Genevieve's visits to Burke. The laughs, the dancing, the music, the joy she'd brought to their lives. Genevieve had such a light, joyous heart, something that Adriana hadn't always experienced in the ups and downs of her life. Which is exactly why she'd been so good for Finn, who'd also seen such dark times. There were many reasons that they were good for each other, but that was definitely one of the highlights for Adriana. Genevieve made Finn happy. Happier than he'd been in years. Adriana's thoughts turned to Eric. Her eyes flitted to the door, still closed, and guilt flooded her heart. His words still stung, yes, but she'd never shut him out before. She wouldn't kick him out if he entered, but she wondered if he was still standing in the hall or if he'd retreated to another room, trying to think his way through this conundrum of an argument. Eric made her happy, just as Genevieve made Finn happy. He was the gentle breeze to her emotional ups and downs that oftentimes resembled a newborn dragon's wobbling flight, just as Genevieve was the cool waters to Finn's burning flames. She soothed that passionate fire, that stubborn will in a way that only one other person had. Benin had been a mentor, a massive icon in their lives, providing for them a role model. But even if tragedy hadn't struck, he'd been an elderly man. Perhaps his time with the Haddocks was short without their knowledge. Of course, there was no replacing him, but there was something to be said about finding a special someone whom you could spend the rest of your life with that held the same values as your mentor did. Adriana's thoughts were a whirl for what felt like hours. She eventually fell into a fitful sleep, thoughts rife with images of broken relationships and arguments and unresolved tension. The sound of a door creaking broke through the images and she startled awake. Though it was dark, she could sense Eric's wince. Sorry. A short pause. I can go. Adriana sighed into her pillow. There's no couch for you to sleep on anymore, so you might as well join me. Silence was the only response. Eric, I was kidding. That didn't sound. Oh gods, Larson. Adriana sat up and grabbed him by the shirt, effectively yanking him into the bed. Be silent and cuddle me. Gods know I need a good cuddle after today. Eric obeyed, and soon his arms were wrapped around her, his chest pressed to her back. Though her cheek was pressed firmly into her pillow, she could feel his breath teasing her hair. Annie. HM. Eric pulled her closer, more snugly against him. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have said what I said earlier. I know you just want to help your brother and fix his relationship with Jen, not protect yourself. What I said doesn't even make sense. Gently, his hand brushed against her cheekbone, soft as a butterfly's wingbit. Please forgive me. Gods blast him, she couldn't stay mad after that apology. She tried. She wanted to. But there had been plenty of times in her life that people apologized to her and she threw it in their face. It had never been a good, healthy reaction. Or mature for that matter. And Eric meant it. He wasn't trying to bribe her or buy back her affection or washing her with trivial gifts that did nothing to soothe her anger anyway. He apologized, admitted how wrong he was, and asked for forgiveness. In the end, that was enough. Turning, Adriana peered at him in the darkness. She brushed his hair out of his face and said, I forgive you. I'm sorry if I hurt you, closing the door in your face. No, I deserved that. You weren't mean about it, and that spoke volumes enough. Eric sighed through his nose. I hate for you to go alone, and I really hope it doesn't make things worse, but if you really want to go to Jet, then I'll stay home with Darren tomorrow. Don't bother finding a sitter. We'll be fine. Warmth blooming in her heart, Adriana leaned forward and kissed him softly. Thank you. Eric kissed her brow and then stretched out on his back. And thank you for allowing me to stay in here. The floor would have been a worthy but painful punishment. Adriana giggled as she wrapped an arm around his chest and kissed his cheek before snuggling into his warmth. He wrapped his arm around her back and trailed his fingers through her hair. Within minutes she felt herself slipping away, but not before she thought that forgiveness, for all the pain that fighting and apologizing created, had to be one of the best medicines. Genevieve plucked at her heart haphazardly. It was the only thing that she felt like doing anymore. Everything else had lost its luster, save for flying with Maximum. But due to the cold season fast approaching, there was only so much time she could spend in the frigid temperatures of the open skies. Though the melancholy pangs of the heart were an echo of her inner turmoil, they weren't as much of an outlet as she'd hoped. She'd found herself unable to paint or dance or sing in the days following the debacle that was the meetings with Braun. She had no interest in food or water, or spending time with her friends, who'd yet to be told about the breakup. Her parents had opted to keep it to themselves, save for Thorin and Ivan, both of whom had sworn they would keep the information to themselves. Even if Finn was a liar and a cheat, they did not want to ruin his reputation for the rest of his career. Better to just break it to people slowly that things didn't work out, and that was that. No need to ruminate in the details. Or so her mother had said. They were handling things as well as they could. Molly and Kiev had tried their best to keep Genevieve talking, drinking tea, encouraging her that these things happened, and while they were most unfortunate, things did get better. But Genevieve's heart was not in it. At least she'd stopped crying. The first few days since Finn's dismissal had been painful. She had tried to put on a brave face and join her parents for breakfast. But the sight of the corner table where they'd had their first date, the hall itself in which she'd spent so much time with him, laughing and teasing and teaching him how to dance, had brought all the memories crashing down around her. She'd fled the hall without so much as a goodbye and burst into tears as soon as she stepped foot outside. It had to get better. It had to. She couldn't carry on like this. She'd never been in such a state of depression, and it simply wasn't healthy. But wasn't mourning healthy? Ignoring the pain, now that would be unhealthy. Pretending that it wasn't a big deal, that she hadn't given him her heart and soul and many times offered herself to be kissed and touched. The memory of his mouth on hers, His hands on her body flashed through her with a pang, and she dropped her hands from the harp. Enough, she told herself. That was all he ever wanted anyway. The stern words did nothing to soothe her aching heart. Nevertheless, she couldn't go on like this. She needed to move on. The sooner she stopped remembering him, that her entire world and future did not belong to him, and it never would, the better. She could move on and have a real life. She'd be forever grateful that he'd come into her life. She'd always look back with thankfulness that they had met. He'd paved the way for her new life of freedom and adventure. Who knew what might happen next? Maybe she'd get to travel, explore other lands, have adventures of her own. And maybe, someday she'd find someone just as kind and special as he pretended to be. A knock sounded. Genevieve started from her chair, surprised at the sound, then instantly full of dread. Who could it be? Surely not Finn. He wouldn't, would he? Genevieve heard the door open and tiptoed into the hallway outside her room to listen. Oh, hello. Molly said, her voice laced with surprise. Did you come alone? I did, a familiar, distinctly female voice said brightly. Is Genevieve home? Oh, well. Her mother seemed to pause, then, as if she could sense Genevieve listening, there was a series of murmured voices. She strained to hear the words, heart pounding, before the session of secrecy halted, and her mother's voice rang out, Genevieve. You have a visitor. Genevieve frowned in dismay. How could her mother betray her like this? She'd made it clear the last few days that she did not want visitors of any kind, and to turn all away. She did not wish to. Oh, Loki and all his minions. Taking a deep breath, Genevieve straightened her spine and made her way to the stairs. She was halfway down them with a displeased comment at the ready, and froze at the sight of Adriana Haddock Larson standing in the foyer with a smile and glittering green eyes. Ah, there she is, Adriana said, tucking her hands into her pockets. And dressed in pants and a sweater as well. Let's take a walk. Her smile grew and Genevieve's heart sank. We have much to talk about. Chapter 5, The Honey and the Hatchet Part 3. Chapter text. Adriana didn't know what to make of Genevieve as the streets gradually gave way to a well-worn dirt path leading into the forest. Like Burke, the foliage around them was crisp and dry, each plant preparing for the coming winter. If the bite in the air was any indication, it was fast approaching. Leaves crunched underfoot, covered in frost. It was still early enough that the sun's rays peeking through the clouds had yet to dispense with the whirls covering the leaves and bushes. Naturally, it was cold. Adriana had almost worn her flight suit, but she'd opted for an outfit lined with wool and fur. She was grateful for the warm clothes and boots. Even the cream-colored white hat contained a lining of some soft fuzzy material that was perfect for the outdoors, and, even better, it was cute. She'd have to thank Taryn for the gift once again when she got home. Genevieve had also bundled up, opting for a pair of fur-lined leggings and boots, a long-sleeved white shirt, and maroon sweater beneath her thick black coat. Even in the cold and wrapped in the thick wool scarf, Genevieve looked as cute and stylish as ever. Though she shivered in the wind, she didn't complain. She merely kept her dark eyes downcast as they walked in silence. Despite all this, Adriana felt a distinct cloud of tension hovering over them. Genevieve was always talkative, always asking questions. She'd barely said 2 words after Adriana's arrival. She could hardly blame her. Adriana felt slightly awkward herself, but she was determined. She would get to the bottom of this ordeal. It wasn't fair or right. As if sensing her thoughts, Genevieve's dark eyes flicked up to meet Adriana and quickly darted away. Her lips pressed into a thin line but she said nothing. Adriana shoved her hands into the pockets of her coat. So? I'm sure you know why I'm here. She'd thought about it all night. How to broach the subject. She'd considered giving Genevieve the opportunity to open the door by simply asking how she was doing, but she didn't think her friend would like that. Better to come right out and say it than pretend otherwise. Why else would she have traveled all this way? Genevieve straightened. Finn sent you. Well, no, I came of my own volition. Why? The dull bitterness in the question wasn't lost on Adriana. I want to hear what happened from your side. What did he tell you, exactly? Genevieve asked, looking at the surrounding trees. Her words were light, but it felt anything but relaxed. I can't imagine that he told you the whole story. Adriana scoffed. Well, that's fresh, seeing as you wouldn't let him explain. Genevieve's boots scuffed against the gravel as she came to a halt, her dark eyes stony and cold. Good. Adriana could relate. She stopped as well and took a deep breath, reminding herself to be patient. She didn't come here to argue or make things worse. I heard everything I needed to know. Genevieve said. Did you? Adriana asked. I find that hard to believe, considering there are some very important details with what actually happened with Rain. Genevieve closed her eyes and seemed to clench her hands inside her coat pockets. Don't say that name. Is she still here, by the way? Because I'd love to give her a piece of my mind while I'm here. I don't know, and I don't care. Genevieve said, her voice wobbling. She strode down the path once more. I just wish all of it would end and everyone would leave me alone. Trying to run from the issue, then. Adriana recognized the defense mechanism. She'd used it plenty of times in her life. Adriana trudged after her, thinking. Jen, I came here to help smooth things over, not to make you upset. Genevieve whirled around. Oh, well, you have a funny way of showing it. Coming all this way to rub in my face the fact that my boyfriend cheated on me with some tramp from another village, and you come here to defend him as if it was some harmless accident. It wasn't a harmless accident, Adriana fired back. It was a mistake made by a hurting 15-year-old boy searching for something to piece together his shattered life, and I assure you he has regretted that mistake ever since the day it happened. Genevieve went white. What? Adriana tried to steady her shaking voice. Ah, so now she wants the full story. A fierce wind blew through the trees, but they hardly noticed, except when Genevieve pushed a few curls out of her face with a shaking hand. I don't understand. Adriana took a deep breath. He told you about the gang and Eric's accident a few years ago. How he left Burke in shame. Genevieve nodded. He landed on Braun and met Rain. From what I know, she was a serving girl and that's how they met. One thing led to another and they ended up spending the night together. Adriana paused at the pained look in Genevieve's eyes. He didn't cheat on you, General. Perhaps not, but, he still. What? He's not pure enough for you. Adriana didn't hold back the venom this time. I don't know the details of what happened that night, but when he found out Rain's true lifestyle, he was so ashamed and disgusted with himself that he left. If he chose to do it, then that's his own fault. Do you think he doesn't know that? Gods, Genevieve, if you even knew how much stress that alone has caused him these last 3 years, you'd understand. Well, I don't. Genevieve said sharply. Young and immature or not, that does not excuse his actions. Nor does it give you the right to insult his character. Adriana said. Not to mention slapping him. Genevieve flinched. So there was some regret after all. Why didn't you let him explain? Adriana demanded, though her voice broke at the end. She'd meant it to sound firm and unyielding, but she wasn't Finn or her parents or even Eric. She'd always been the emotional one. Though she didn't feel the sting of tears, she felt frustration and something that felt an awful lot like betrayal. After everything that's happened with our family, all the crap, you know that my brother and I have had dark moments. Anna. Let me finish, Adriana interrupted, and Genevieve pursed her lips. Believe me, I know what it's like to be cheated on. For my boyfriend to wrongfully ask things of me that he had no right to ask, just to turn around and sleep with the local barkeep. I know what that sort of pain feels like. Genevieve's eyes welled with tears then, and Adriana had to take a fortifying breath. Finn watched me go through all of that. He was so disgusted and angry with what Brandine had done. And it was Finn who held me and let me cry, not my mom or my dad or even Eric. It was Finn who helped me grieve and pick up the pieces. Adriana's eyes burned now and she struggled to speak around the emotion. My sweet brother who would never cheat on a girl he cared for, like Brandine did to me. Ever. So I'll ask you again, why didn't you let him explain? You let him explain everything that he's ever been through, from the gang to Eric's leg to becoming a slave, and yes, even blaming himself for Benen's death, and yet this was the one thing that you couldn't give him the chance to explain. I want to know why. Tears had left icy tracks down Genevieve's cheeks. More followed when she blinked and shook her head. I don't know, it was many things. Such as, he's been elusive the last few months. We've always kept up steady communication by Terramail, and when he made plans to visit, he'd always be late. Adriana frowned. He's got a busy schedule. Yes, but this is different, Genevieve insisted. I'd ask where he'd gone off to and he wouldn't answer the question directly. He'd always say something vague like exploring with Zap, or I took a few extra turns around the archipelago. The first few times I didn't mind, of course. As you said, he is busy, so he should be allowed to take some for himself now and then, and I am not so possessive that he must spend all of his free time with me. But it became a habit. He's always late, and sometimes he appears ruffled when he shows up. Ruffled? I don't suppose the wind has anything to do with it? Adriana asked dryly. No, Genevieve said with a bite of annoyance. I know the difference, and I know when he's lying. He's not as adept at that as some. True, though Adriana didn't want to admit it. Genevieve was smart and she didn't normally jump to conclusions, so perhaps. What if there was more to the story? Shoving that thought away, Adriana crossed her arms. Is that it? Genevieve paused. No. In the 10 months we've been together, I've noticed that, when we, Her cheeks suddenly went pink and she looked away. Adriana resisted the urge to snort. The embarrassment of young people prior to marriage. A strange sensation swept through her. It wasn't that long ago that she herself was awkward and blushing at such a topic as kissing. Now, look at her. I'm a married woman now, Adriana said with a touch of amusement. And I am fully aware of all its benefits. An awkward smile broke out on Genevieve's face and she covered it with a hand. Am I so transparent? The blush gave it away, and I think I know what you're going to say anyway. Adriana cleared her throat. Finn mentioned it. Genevieve cringed. What did he say? Mainly that he has a hard time controlling himself when things get heated, and when he pulls away, you get upset. Ah well, that makes me sound very pure. We are what we are, Adriana shrugged. It's not easy for some to say no. But this brings us full circle, doesn't it? The reason he'd pull away is because of what happened with Rain. Genevieve blinked, looking wary. Unsure. After what happened with Rain, Finn, well, when he came home. It was a hard road. He had to earn back his people's respect, mend broken relationships, including the one with me and Eric. He had to learn in some of the most painful, humbling ways how to be a good person again. How to be kind and respectful and forgive others, and even to forgive himself for things that were out of his control. Like Benen's death. Adriana pushed away the sadness that welled up in her chest. Yes. It was over a year before things started to look normal again. But up until your brother and dad visited Burke for the first time, he wasn't dating anyone. Many people wondered why, but deep down, he'd never forgiven himself for what happened with Rain. He didn't trust himself. My family and Cliff started encouraging him. We'd seen his progress and... Adriana huffed in amusement. You know him, General, not one day has passed that you haven't seen the real fearless Finn. He's kind and loyal and stubborn, and sometimes he can't see what's standing right in front of him. Genevieve breathed a laugh and wiped at her face. Because of what's happened to him, he's cautious and careful, and especially in regards to girls, he took a big step back. Even when he had interest in some girls, he didn't trust himself, and didn't take any chances. And then Adriana said, taking a step closer and placing her hand on her friend's arm. He met you. Genevieve's lips wobbled and she shook her head. God's help him, he couldn't stay away. He couldn't stop talking about you. Finn is older than me by a few minutes, and I mean this honestly, he has never talked about any girl like he has with you. Adriana ducked down until their eyes met. Don't think for one moment that hasn't terrified him. I don't think he has ever thought of you as just another girl. Quite the opposite. I think he's handled this relationship with more care than any he's had before, and not just girlfriends. Out of fear that he'll screw it up. Exactly. He still doesn't think he's good enough, even though he's proven himself time and time again. Or do you disagree? Genevieve sniffed and wiped her face again. No, he has, but I don't know what to do from here. I don't know if I can reconcile myself with what happened with Rain. He's not the same person anymore. Perhaps not, but if we... Genevieve swallowed hard. If we were to continue our relationship. If he's not a virgin, then how can I continue that relationship knowing that he's already, and with someone else? I'm not so sure if that's the case. As I said, I don't know the details. Adriana said carefully. That's something that you'd have to discuss with him. And she added in a firmer tone. That's something you'll have to decide for yourself, too. If, worst case scenario, he's not a virgin, but he has since not made that his lifestyle, it was a one-time occurrence a few years ago, would it be so bad to forgive him for that lapse in judgment, as he himself sees it, and then have a happy and blessed life together? Genevieve's eyes were downcast and puffy. Adriana took a deep breath, gentling her voice. Well. Genevieve's eyes rose to her face in confusion. Brandine took mine from me. Something that I should have had the choice to decide when and who I gave it to. In fact, I did decide, I told him no. And that choice was taken from me. Trust me, I understand the seriousness of it. Adriana took a deep breath and shed the old emotions that had come surging upward from the depths of her mind. There were many times that, going into my relationship with Eric, that I thought I wouldn't be good enough. I felt tainted, and I honestly never wanted intimacy again. And I know without a doubt that if I said no even after getting married, even after having Darren, Eric would have kept his distance in that regard. He's a good man. Genevieve said quietly. Yes. But Adriana said, unable to hide the smile. Well, after we got engaged, there was no shortage of kisses, and I'm still surprised by it sometimes. The wanting. And after we got married, well, I had to address my feelings and emotions. It's as much a mental thing as it is a physical. But all that to say, I remember thinking of myself as ruined and that I never wanted to be in that situation again, and that Eric deserved better. All those thoughts were wrong, except the part of perhaps not wanting to be in that situation again. I suppose I didn't anticipate my mind changing over time. Adriana was rambling and she knew it. Genevieve didn't seem bothered. In fact, she was listening with rapt attention. But my mind did change. My perspective of myself changed. I was not tainted or ruined because of what Brandine did. I did not need to resist something good and beautiful with my husband because of that, though there have been times where I've not been in the mood and said no, and that is okay, too. But the same applies for Finn. Adriana sighed. I'm afraid that he's not allowing himself to be happy because of his past choices. He doesn't need to hold himself to such a high standard of perfection that if, and when, he makes a mistake, he thinks he's worthless. He's not worthless. Genevieve was staring at the fur lining her jacket. No, he is not. And I only confirmed his fears when I overreacted. Adriana's heart swelled, though she fought to keep her voice level. Yes. Perhaps he should learn to control himself more if passion gets the better of him, or she broke off in a small laugh. Maybe you both should just get married and reap the benefits. Gods know that's the best way to fix the situation. Genevieve gaped. Adriana. Sorry, but it's true. They shared a laugh, though it was short-lived. Genevieve sighed, as if shedding a weight off her shoulders. Though her eyes were still puffy and her voice was thick with emotion, she stood straighter. I have much to think about, it seems. But you will think about it? Adriana asked softly. Seeing him again. Genevieve's pained expression returned. I don't. Please, Adriana said, ignoring the pleading in her tone. At least talk to him about it. He's heartbroken. I haven't seen him this upset about something since. No, she didn't want to compare this to Benen's death and accidentally manipulate Genevieve into it. The choice needed to be hers and hers alone. She took a deep breath. Just think about it. Genevieve's glassy eyes had turned east, towards Burke. I will. Hiccup had been standing in an alcove of the arena long enough that when the cold of the stone wall seeped into his body enough to make him shiver, his leg gave a sharp spasm. He hissed through his teeth and shook out the limb, eyes not once leaving his quarry. He'd probably have to soak his leg in hot water tonight. Gods, winter was starting early. They had yet to get their first heavy snow, but he could feel it coming, if the pain in his leg was any indication. And yet, he stayed. Even if his son was completely unaware of his presence, he didn't feel right just leaving him to brood alone. If hacking all the training dummies into smithereens could be considered brooding, anyway. He and Toothless had been flying home after taking a few laps around the island, surveying from which direction the storm might be coming, which seemed to be the north. The wind had gotten so turbulent in the skies, however, that he'd eventually told Toothless to turn back. But it was the array of what appeared to be bodies strewn around the floor of the arena that made them pause as they flew by. At least they hadn't panicked and warned Finn to their arrival. They'd crept in quietly, Toothless' sharp eyes likely noting that the bodies were not, in fact, human. Still, Hiccup had told Toothless to carry on home and he'd stay with Finn. Even if he didn't know it. Finn hacked through a dummy, wood splintering, but his aim was sloppy. It barely hit the target, and the dummy merely hobbled on its peg legs before, with a frustrated yell, Finn kicked it over. And then kicked it again. And again. And again. The dummy clattered against the stone wall in a heap, the straw head busted almost comically, but Hiccup found none of this even remotely funny. He pursed his lips, watching as Finn surveyed the damage he'd caused, panting heavily enough that his shoulders rose and fell. Soon his hands went to his hair like Hiccup often did and he began to pace the arena, forcing himself to calm down. Hiccup wondered at how healthy this was, but ultimately decided that it was better than the alternatives. He had to get the frustration out somehow. Whatever Adriana had said, it had helped at least. Finn had woken with the sun and had breakfast with his mother, something he'd been avoiding. He was trying. But after Adriana's trip to Jet a few days ago and subsequent conversation with Genevieve, they'd still heard no word. Naturally, Finn was frustrated and hurt and likely still blamed himself. Hiccup understood. He really did. But he hardly thought Genevieve was being fair. How could anyone judge today's events based on the sins committed years prior? Not in this situation anyway. It's not like Finn was a murderer or had committed some heinous crime that warranted fear for her life. Hiccup knew the Jatans were traditional, adhering to a high moral standard that made their way of living stricter than most. He doubted that most couples were allowed to go on dates unchaperoned. Finn, being who he was, likely explained why this wasn't the case for him and Genevieve. But of course certain things were likely expected of them, even from Genevieve's point of view. She'd grown up with certain expectations and standards that would be adhered to, or... He understood. But it didn't matter right now anyway. He didn't want to believe it to be true, but if Genevieve truly thought that she was better off without Finn in her life, well, there was little anyone could do. It was ultimately her decision to make. His thoughts froze at the flaw in that statement. It wasn't just Genevieve's decision to make. Perhaps, maybe Finn was giving up too easily. He was obviously distressed and frustrated, and he was doing his best to respect her wishes to stay away, but, well, didn't Finn also have a say in what happened? They needed to discuss this, like adults. Gods, it wasn't even his relationship and he had a headache. He'd been thoroughly blessed to have Astrid. Perhaps he'd dragged his feet about proposing and actually getting married, but they'd never endured something like this. They'd almost divorced, that had been painful, but it had never been like this. They'd had problems, but none of it revolved around accused cheating or secret relationships. Which only frustrated him. Finn hadn't cheated, and he hadn't hidden a secret relationship from Genevieve. He didn't deserve all of this guilt and stress. He was a good kid who'd worked hard to be a good person after doing so many bad things. He and Genevieve belonged together. Was it too much to want his son to be happy for once? Hiccup blinked out of his thoughts when Finn sighed and dropped his hands. He gazed at the destruction he'd caused around the arena and seemed to slump further. Maybe he'd burned off some frustration, but it hadn't made him feel any better. Something twisted in Hiccup's chest, then. At seeing his son standing in the middle of the arena, looking tired and sad and utterly alone. Enough. He couldn't stand by and let his son look so depressed. Hiccup had just pushed off the wall, ignoring the pain in his leg, when the sound of flapping wings filled the arena. He paused as a familiar dragon crooned. Finn looked up in time to see Zap land a few feet away. "Hey, Zappy girl," Finn murmured. Realizing his mood, Zap crept forward until she stood before him, blue eyes meeting blue. The arena was silent, and Hiccup waited, not daring to move or breathe too loudly or Zap would take notice. Finally, so quietly he almost didn't catch it, Finn whispered, "I miss her." Zap crooned and brushed her nose against his forehead. Almost like a tether had snapped, Finn flung his arms around his dragon and buried his face in her scales. Zap rumbled and ducked her head, snuggling into his back as her tail swished against the stones. Though the image pulled at Hiccup's heart, he stepped back into the darkness of the alcove. His son would be all right. Right now, he had Zap. But that didn't change the fact that something needed to change. Either Finn and Genevieve needed to talk, or... well, he supposed the only alternative was time. The time it would take for Finn's heart to slowly mend. And a slow process it would likely be. Sighing through his nose, Hiccup crept back up the walkway as quietly as he could. With the lack of sound, his prosthetic would be hard to mask, but they didn't seem to notice. Not until he reached the top and tripped on the landing, sending a sharp snick echoing through the arena. Finn and Zap faced the doorway, but he'd already left it behind. And when Finn got home a while later, looking tired but alert, he didn't question it. In the days that followed Adriana's visit, it had gotten decidedly colder, and Genevieve already wished it was over. She wasn't ready for months of bitter winds, icy streets, or wearing half a dozen layers just to stay warm. Then again, this was the first winter she regularly wore pants, and nobody said a word about it. In fact, it wasn't uncommon to see many women, particularly the younger generations, shedding their skirts and dresses in favor of warmer clothing. Finn had been right. Though she couldn't see it a year ago, even her little island's culture could change in time. He'd been so confident and yet patient at her insistence that there was no way she would ever ride or train a dragon, let alone be allowed to regularly wear something as scandalous as pants. Now look at her. Pants, a beloved dragon who'd become a parent, and a happy jet. Well, mostly. She couldn't quite stifle the ache in her chest at the thought of those first few weeks of getting to know Finn. Had it really almost been a year since he'd come to train her village? And in little more than a month, they would have had their 1-year anniversary. She squashed the thought as she trudged through the windy streets until she arrived at her house. It was empty at this hour, her family spread to the winds. She'd spent some time at the elders' home to play the lyre and then gone on a flight with Maximum. She'd even gone to her favorite tea shop and chatted with Rosmatar for a bit. She was trying to find a new normal, or perhaps, go back to how things had been before, but it was futile. Memories of their dates around Jet accosted her at every turn. Strolls through the village. Visiting the greenhouse and planting flowers. Long flights around the island. Running the dirt paths surrounding the village, climbing the foothills and mountains. Shopping at the stores in town for leather, weapons, jewelry and even music. Laughing to the point of tears when he tried to play a long, hollowed-out instrument called a lyre. As she remembered his bulging cheeks and eyes, Genevieve found herself grinning and shook herself. She shucked her boots and coat before filling a kettle and setting it over the flames in the fireplace. She even had memories of cooking and baking cookies in this very kitchen. To this day, she still had a hard time cooking or baking anything, and Finn had seemingly made it his mission to teach her everything he knew. Too bad it had all turned out to be a lie. No, she shook herself. Not a lie. Just what? Adriana knew what bad men were like. She wouldn't make excuses for one, brother or no. Genevieve had to believe that if Finn had done something wrong, Adriana would have put him in his place. Not come all this way just to stick up for him if he'd well and truly deserved to be cut off. Still, it hurt. The fact that he'd told her everything, his hopes and dreams, his fears, his darkest secrets about being a slave, blaming himself for Binen's death, being responsible for Eric's leg but left out what happened with Rain. After all, that was a vital piece of information to tell your girlfriend. Right. The kettle whistled and Genevieve sighed, grabbing the nearest towel and retrieving the tin pot. She found her favorite mug and paused, realizing that Finn had made it for her. A hand-carved piece with waves and clouds and whirls depicting the wind. And their initials carved into the bottom inside a heart. Enough, Genevieve said to herself and set down the mug before grabbing the tin containing her favorite herbal tea. It's just a mug. Sure, just a mug that he'd purchased and decorated with his own hands and even admitted to slicing his own thumb open in the process. But it had been worth it, he'd said. Worth it for her. Genevieve stared down at the tea leaves swirling in the hot water, turning it a murky brown. He was so thoughtful. Thoughtful in a way that most probably didn't realize. Most saw the heir, the future chief, the serious exterior, the seasoned warrior, even at 18 years old. Not many knew the inner struggles, the painful experiences he'd gone through. Public speculation aside, most people didn't know that he had a heart for slaves because he'd been one. Not many knew that he wanted to protect more than his own territory when he became chief. And while she still hoped that he would someday accomplish those dreams, she had hoped to be there, basking in the glow of his victory when one day, he succeeded. Sighing again, she stirred a drop of cream and a large teaspoon of caramel into her tea before realizing she'd grabbed the wrong pot, intending for honey. Oh well. The caramel drizzling off the spoon reminded her of his first visit to Jet when she'd made him a mug of her favorite caramel apple cider, and he'd teased her mercilessly for how much caramel she'd added. Now there's a smile I didn't think I'd see again. Genevieve nearly leaped out of her skin and almost spilled her mug. Whipping around, she saw Thuggery standing in the entryway. Normally he was so loud and boisterous, but a quick glance down revealed the thick woolen socks, which effectively masked any sounds he made. Gods above, Genevieve huffed, a hand at her throat. Don't scare me like that. Sorry, Thuggery grinned as he hopped into a bar stool and grinned at her across the counter. Want to make me some leaf water? Genevieve ignored the jab and grabbed him a large mug. Don't call it that just to annoy me. After all, her brother enjoyed tea just as much as she did. He only called it that because of Finn. But I do so love making you smile. Genevieve slid the mug across the counter and handed him the cream and honey. I'm not smiling now. She tasted her tea nervously, hoping the caramel hadn't ruined it. It was strange, but not completely abhorrent. She took another sip. Thuggery said, adding various components to his own mug and stirring. There's been an awful lack of fun around here lately. It's starting to grate on my nerves. Naturally you would take offense at others' pain. Now don't be like that, Thuggery wagged a finger. As I said, I'm not here to annoy. And yet. Thuggery snorted and slurped his tea before recoiling. Gods, that's hot. Well, let it cool. So Thuggery said, hissing through his teeth to likely soothe his burning tongue. When, exactly, are you going to make up with Finn? Genevieve set her mug down perhaps a bit too firmly, but the question had thrown her off. Who said I'm going to? Jen, come on. You said yourself that if he didn't actually cheat on you, then maybe. Maybe what? I can just ignore the fact that this tryst of sorts he had with another girl carries some importance. Thuggery sighed. You always were a stickler for following the rules. You do it to avoid what people will say if they find out. But you don't have to be like that. Your point? My point is, Thuggery said in a firm voice he rarely used. The guy is crazy about you and you are crazy about him, and it's not fair to cut him loose when he didn't do anything to hurt you. If he didn't cheat on you, then you have nothing over him. He never told me. Jen, why would he? Put yourself in his shoes and think about it. If that's something that he's embarrassed about, that he is not proud of, why would he tell you? Not to mention if he knew that you, me, and Mom and Dad have talked about it, he'd probably be quite mortified. I know I would be. But. No buts, Thuggery interrupted. We had no business knowing, and sorry to say this, but you made it all worse by embarrassing him in front of Mom and Dad and having him thrown out. He didn't deserve that. Guilt twisted in her gut and she frowned into her mug. I know. Then why don't you stop being stubborn and contact him? Apologize and talk to him. It's not so simple. With girls, it never is. Thuggery sighed and slurped his tea once more. Listen, it doesn't have to be complicated. Forget what happened with this other girl. I can't. No, just listen to me for a minute, okay? Thuggery insisted. He even reached out and took her hand, which surprised her. Forget the girl and think about everything that's happened in this last year. Think about him and everything you've ever known about him. Don't pretend that you don't remember because what does my bestest bra call it, doofy smile. Genevieve snorted at the use of Cliff's language. I believe Adriana came up with that one. Regardless, that doofy smile when I came in spoke volumes. Thuggery squeezed her hand. Even when you're hurt and upset, you miss him. I can't imagine that it's going to be easy to look him in the eye and hear the story, let alone apologize, but I think it's the right thing to do. Listen to what he has to say and then decide if he's worth keeping around. If he's not, then at least you'll both have closure. Or he grinned. We can all move on as if nothing ever happened. Genevieve highly doubted that. This wasn't something that could just be easily forgotten, even if they could fix things. But what if? Genevieve swallowed as Thuggery released her hand and crossed his arms against the counter. What if he doesn't want to see me? You're right, I embarrassed him and I even slapped him. Thuggery blinked at that. Well, just send him a terror message and see what he says. Finn doesn't tend to beat around the bush. Meaning he'll be blunt when he says he doesn't want to see me. Jen, I can bet you solid gold coins that he's just as torn up about this as you. How do you know? He's not particularly forthcoming with most people about his feelings. Thuggery bit the inside of his cheek. A clear sign that he was hiding something. Genevieve's stomach dropped. Oh gods, is he here? No. Thuggery raised his hands. Not him. Hiccup was here earlier. Had a meeting with Ivan, don't look so terrified. Do you know what they discussed? Not you, I can promise you that much. If he wanted to talk about you and Finn, he'd be talking to Dad, don't you think? Genevieve groaned into her hands. But you know something or you wouldn't have brought it up. I didn't bring it up. It's not my fault you're so smart. Thuggery paused. Ivan asked how Finn was and Hiccup just. All he said was that they were dealing with it. They were dealing with it? Genevieve asked. What does that even mean? I suspect that will be your job to figure out, not mine. I'm obnoxious, but I'm not nosy. Anyway, he already left. He just had to catch up on a few things with Ivan before the ice sets in and it'll be harder to travel. We likely won't see them again until spring. Thuggery said with a leading edge to his voice. Which means? She met his eyes. You want us to make up before then? It's going to be a hard winter. It's gotten colder sooner than usual. We only just finished the harvest last week and we almost lost a third of it to frost. Genevieve chewed her lip. She wasn't sure what to do. How could she face Finn after what had happened? And now she had very little time to decide. It's been over a week, Thuggery said, standing and finishing off his tea. You need to talk to him, that's all I'm saying. I doubt he'll want to talk to me, Thug. Not after what I said. Thuggery shrugged. There's only one way to find out. He trudged up the stairs and disappeared, but his words lingered. Should she send Finn a message? What would she say? How would they meet? The implications of such a meeting made a tendril of fear coil in her stomach and suddenly she felt quite nauseated. But Thuggery, Adriana, her parents, all of them had said the same thing, talk to Finn, discuss what happened. But she hadn't heard from Finn. Surely if he wanted to talk, he would have contacted her, right? Except, she'd kicked him out. She told him that she never wanted to speak to him again. She'd called him a liar and a cheat and unworthy of her time. She remembered the flash of hurt in his blue eyes, as if she'd thrown stones at him. She'd wielded just the right weapons to hurt and break him. Of course he hadn't contacted her. Why would he? He thought she hated him. And Adriana said he thought he deserved it, that her words had only proved the doubts he'd had about himself for years. Because of a mistake he'd made at 15. Though doubt still coiled in her veins, she felt, for the first time, like she understood. Such a fundamental part of him, a burden he'd carried for years, not trusting himself to do the right thing when he so badly wanted to, and she'd thrown it in his face the moment she had the opportunity. Confirming his worst fears. That he could do anything he set his mind to except be worthy of a girl's affection, and she would deem him not worth her time. Adriana was right. He was deserving of it. This was the first time something had happened in nearly a year of dating that they'd had a serious issue, and it was cloaked in confusion and embarrassment and shame. In her desire to weed out the truth, and in her assumption that he'd only ever been with her, she'd hurt him worse than she'd ever thought. No wonder he always clammed up when they tried to talk about intimacy. No wonder he always pulled away when things got too heated. Forcing him to talk about it, combined with Rain's arrival and the awkward conversation, no wonder he'd been so upset and mortified. Furthermore, conversation was not always Finn's strong suit. He was smart, yes, but he didn't always do well under pressure, and sometimes his emotions got the better of him. And when she wielded her own emotions into sharpened weapons intended to inflict pain, he hadn't known what to say that would make things better or worse. And instead of being kind and patient and compassionate, she grew selfish and angry and dumped him. Gods, she was a fool. Everyone was right. She needed to apologize. She had to speak to him. But she wouldn't be sending a message by terrible terror. That would take too much time, nearly half a day to obtain a response. It was nearing 4 in the afternoon. She could make it to Burke before darkness fell completely. With strengthened resolve, Genevieve marched up the stairs and into her room before locating her warmest set of clothing. She would go to Burke tonight and talk to Finn. Even if he told her she was inconsiderate and cruel and short-sighted, she had to try. She left a note on the counter for her family, not bothering to tell Thuggery where she was going, and stepped outside. She located Max in the barn and quickly saddled him, ignoring his croon of displeasure at the prospect of flying right now. Genevieve glanced at the white sky, heavy with clouds. A fierce wind blew in from the sea that sent snowflakes scattering through the air, but she ignored it. No griping now, Genevieve said to Max, who stretched his wings. We're going to see Zap and the babies. Don't you want to see them? Max crooned in question as she rose into her saddle and quickly buckled her legs into the stirrups Eric had made. Already her fingertips felt numb with cold, so she pulled down the mittens attached to the gloves. Come on, Max, Genevieve said, leaning forward. We've got to get to Burke. Come on, hurry up. Finn shouted over the gusting of the wind. Villagers hauling thick wicker baskets full of blankets, pillows, toys, and other necessities rushed by, eager to get within the safety of the great hall. Women carried children while the men carried the brunt of the baggage, except for a fair few. Fishlegs Ingerman carried 5 children in his arms, all shivering but grinning at the prospect of spending the night in the great hall. Rough Nut, however, carried a wide arrangement of bags beneath her thin arms. Need a hand? Finn asked as she nearly tripped on the top step. Normally I'd say no, Rough Nut said in a husky voice as she threw 3 bags into his outstretched hands. But I think I lost a kid. Gods, I hope not, Finn said, staring down the stairs that were lost to the elements. A cloud of white had obscured the majority of their village and it was hard to make out anything. You'll be hard-pressed to find anyone in this mess. I'll do a head count inside, Rough Nut shrugged. They tend to show up eventually when they wish to be fed, the little minions. Finn found this comment slightly disturbing, but the Ingermans hadn't lost any children yet. He followed Rough Nut to her family's chosen spot by a column and dropped off the bags. He watched as Rough Nut shouted, "Sound off," and grinned when each of the Ingerman kids, including Helga, shouted off a number. When the youngest squeaked their number, Rough Nut slapped his arm. All accounted for. Glad to hear it, Finn said, straightening his coat and heading back to the door. He'd hate to have to organize a search party for any lost children in a storm such as this. His father had taken an impromptu trip to Jet that morning. Finn hadn't asked for details on the trip. He didn't want to know, and he hoped it was regarding trade or peaceful relations or some manner of chiefly jargon that had nothing to do with him and his ex-girlfriend. Still, Hiccup had given him a single questioning look that morning over breakfast. Finn had shook his head, firmly stating that no, he did not want to accompany him, and that was that. However, his heart had leaped into his throat when Hiccup and Toothless had returned with tense expressions. He'd thought for a horrible moment that something bad had happened. Jet had been raided, there'd been an accident, Genevieve was hurt or worse. But he'd immediately berated himself as his father had gathered the council and stated the winter storm they'd all felt coming for the last week was heading straight for Burke, and they needed to gather the village into the Great Hall immediately. A few hours after Hiccup's return, it had been merely windy. The sky had been overcast and bitterly cold. Villagers had quickly chosen spots in the Great Hall with their families, including his own, but there were stragglers. He'd mentally prepared for the chaos. Once he saw shingles fly off of more than a few roofs, he knew the storm was upon them. He completely lost track of time after that. All he saw was the rush of faces, the pink skin, the frozen bits from the icy wind, the dry flaky scales on more dragons than he could count. The hatchery was massive and would hold a few hundred dragons within its walls, but it wasn't enough to hold everyone. Even Zap and the pups had come to the Great Hall. Their little barn at home might be enough to protect them, but he didn't want to take any chances, and neither did Zap apparently. The pups in question were at least a good distraction for the children. The ensuing chaos had forced all the adults into action, and many had dropped off their young children at the Great Hall early in order to run home and grab last-minute necessities. Adriana, Taryn and Morgan had volunteered to watch the children, but found it unnecessary as the 5 shockjaw pups were plenty of entertainment for the kids. Finn surveyed the bustling crowd as he resumed a post toward the front of the doors. They'd be ready to close the doors soon. He could just barely make out a few dark shapes in the blizzard outside and waved them forward. The Great Hall was filled with plenty of food and drink to last the villagers for a week, but winter was just beginning. They couldn't stay in here forever. Hopefully the storm would end soon and they could all return to their homes. That's the last of them. Horst shouted and Finn nodded toward the guards posted at the doors. They each grabbed a thick ring and pulled, the wind outside suctioning against the wood and making them difficult to close. Wait. Hold the doors. We've got one more. As the doors reopened, Finn surveyed the massive monstrous nightmare that swept in. It landed and shook ice and snow off its wings with a shudder. The man in the saddle was coated with snow and ice, and the only defining feature that he could see were the dark eyes above the shawl wrapped around his face. Spotting him, the man dismounted, a bit stiffly, and strode toward Finn. Gods, I did not expect that. His voice was vaguely familiar. Finn watched as the man pulled aside the nearly frozen shawl. Thuggery. The one and only Thuggery said, but his voice lacked its usual bravado. Though his skin was bright pink with cold, his dark eyes shot around the surrounding crowd, as if in search of someone. What are you doing here? Finn asked quietly. Thuggery's dark eyes shot to his. Why do you think? Finn pursed his lips and turned away. Do we have to do this now? Well, seeing as it's a matter of life and death, yes. Life and death, now. Finn strode through the crowd. Sure it sucks, but I wasn't aware that life couldn't move on. That's what she wanted, isn't it? No, that's not, Thuggery huffed. Where is she? When I find her I'm going to shake her. Finn froze. Wait. What do you mean? She's not here. Finn stared, aghast as Thuggery's face went white. No, don't tell me. Genevieve left the house a few hours ago, Thuggery said. I told her she needed to talk to you, but I didn't mean today. But you know how she gets an idea. Thuggery, where is she? Gods, that's what I'm trying to tell you. Thuggery said. She left a note, but it was an hour before we noticed, so I came after her. She probably didn't know there was a storm coming, if she's not here. Finn didn't stay for the rest. He turned and sprinted to the area where his family would be staying with the Larsons. Genevieve wasn't here. If she was, someone would have pointed it out by now. Gods, what was she thinking? Where was she? She could be anywhere, and if she'd left before Thuggery, then she was lost. He tried not to panic as he skidded to a halt and threw on his coat and warmer boots. Eric and Adriana stared at him from their own bedrolls, Darin playing between them. "Where are you going?" Eric asked. "Genevieve," Finn said, yanking on gloves. "Of course, after 2 weeks she picks today to visit, and now she's lost in the storm." "What?" Adriana yelped. "I've got to find her." Eric climbed to his knees. "Do you want help?" "No, you stay. We don't need a dozen people getting lost." "But what if you get lost?" Eric cried. Finn ignored him and shoved through the crowd until he found Zap sitting with her pups, who climbed over her back with reckless abandon. "Zap, you're going to hate me, but I need a favor," he whispered in her ear, and she growled, slapping her tail against the floor. "Look, I don't want to go out there either, but we have to find Jen and Maximum. They should have been here by now." Zap sighed through her nose, which might have been funny in another situation. Perhaps the mention of her mate annoyed her. After all, he should have smelled the storm coming. Maybe he had, and Genevieve had pushed him onward. Max was strong, but even his wings couldn't handle 5 hours in an ice storm. What if they'd fallen into the ocean? No, Finn clamped down on that thought as Zap rose to her feet and shook her hide. Readying for the outdoors. No. He'd find her. He'd find her if he had to stay out all night. The pups rose to their feet as well and stretched their wings, but Zap growled at them. They stared up at her with wide eyes, their light and dark scales flickering in the torchlight. Under the intensity of her glare, one by one, they each sat back down. They looked a little put out, but obeyed. Finn might have been impressed if his heart wasn't thundering in his ears. Murmurs broke out around them as he rose into his saddle. "Horst, open the doors." Horst's eyes went wide. Nobody was supposed to go outside. The temperature was dropping. Genevieve and Max wouldn't have much time. He didn't have time to waste. A strong hand grabbed him by the collar and yanked him down, almost out of his saddle. He came nose to nose with his mother. "What in the gods' names are you doing?" "Genevieve's out there," Finn whispered. The intensity in Astrid's eyes faded. "What? Are you sure?" "Yes. Thuggery is here." Thuggery appeared with Hiccup at his side. His face and hands were bright red in the warmth of the great hall. "I'll come with you." "No, 4 hours in this storm is enough," Hiccup said firmly. "No arguments," he added when Thuggery opened his mouth again. He looked up at Finn with a grave expression. "You find her and you find shelter." Finn nodded once and sat up when his mother released his collar. Zap flapped her wings until they were high above the crowd and waited as Hiccup ordered the doors to be opened. "Finn." He looked down and saw his parents, Eric and Adriana and Darin, all staring up at him. His nephew stuck up a hand and waved, and Finn smiled at the sight. Hiccup's arms were crossed. "Be careful." Finn nodded again and barely held on as Zap shot forward into the icy storm. They gasped at the pure pain of the storm, like hitting a wall of ice. Cold so thorough that the wind tore through clothing and formed icicles in the nostrils, caused limbs to freeze up. Ice pelted Zap's wings. Snow accumulated in heavy drafts so thick that they could barely see a few feet in front of them in any direction. Gods, how was he going to find Genevieve in this? "We don't have a lot of time, Zap," Finn shouted, leaning forward. He could barely hear himself over the wind. Where would she go? He thought briefly of the most sensible places. Though Genevieve could at times not think through something all the way before doing it, not realizing the consequences, she was very smart. She would know to find shelter. She and Max had made it to Burke. They had to. Finn wouldn't consider the alternative. He couldn't. Not after everything that had happened. Zap darted to the side with a yelp. The hatchery passed in a blur, dark against the frozen tundra. Already it was buried in several feet of snow. Far below, the ocean crashed against the cliffside, black and foreboding. If anyone fell in there, they were done for. Finn steered them clear of the drop and shuddered. Where would she go? What made the most sense? Let's go home first. It was a bit of a flight in this weather, but his house was the first establishment when flying from the west. If she made it to Burke, she could make it to his house. It took twice as long to get there than usual. They were buffeted to and fro by the winds and pelted by ice and snow. Zap roared multiple times in frustration, eager just as he was to find their quarry. But when they finally made it to the bridge, they opted to land and make the trek across on foot. The winds shooting upward from the canyon below were too strong and Zap simply wasn't strong enough to fight through them. Finn kept a firm grip on her saddle to keep his footing. It was slow work and he was sweating beneath his clothes, which he knew to be a bad combination in the current elements, but they finally made it across the bridge. They stared into the tundra ahead. The familiar paths were gone, the trees barely visible. "Come on, girl," Finn bounded forward. Zap yelped and kept close, likely afraid of losing him. What felt like eons later, they came across a familiar line through the trees, obscured by snow. Though the branches hung low with ice that crunched against his arms as he pushed them aside for Zap, they finally caught sight of the house in the distance. They ran toward it and Finn nearly slipped on the front porch as he grappled with the door, his gloves cold and wet. Finn threw the door open and found the interior dark and cold. Empty. Jen. Not a sound. Panting, he turned back outside and shut the door firmly behind him. The yard, the surrounding woods, even the barn, they were all buried in snow. The wind howled, snow covered in ice crunched beneath his boots. "Genevieve!" Finn shouted, cupping his hands around his mouth. Nothing. Panic settled at the edges of his mind. "Where are you, where are you, where are you?" "Gods, not like this!" Finn whispered. "Please, not like this." Zap crooned and pressed her nose into his shoulder. Her warmth seeped into him, prickling his senses, but he ignored it. He couldn't let himself consider getting warm and comfortable. He'd stay out all night if he had to. Zap's head snapped up. Her nostrils flared. Then she yelped and darted into the snow. "Zap, wait!" Finn darted after her, feet sinking into more than a foot of snow. He could barely keep track of her in the blizzard, but he forced himself to keep going, stepping in her deep tracks to save time and energy. She ran away from the house and toward the hillside. That's when Finn realized the wind was blowing toward the village. She could smell them. "That's it, girl. Find them." She kept running, pausing every few minutes to sniff the air before plunging onward into the white abyss. Finn had a difficult time keeping up, but gritted his teeth and pressed on. His hands were cold inside his gloves and he was sure to have windburn on his face, but he didn't care. Zap came to a halt before a large mound of snow and sniffed, crooning. Finn ran to catch up. "Come on, Zap, we will." He crashed into something soft and heavy and tumbled over it, crashing headfirst into a snowbank. He groaned and lifted his head as something moaned in a deep voice. Snow and ice cracked above him and slowly, a deep blue wing appeared. "Max." Finn scrambled out of the snow and darted around to the massive shockjaw's head, which was barely visible. Max was curled up on the ground, covered in layers of ice and snow. He was clearly shivering, but his eyes were clear. Being a species of water dragon, this could not be good for him. And curled up in a tight ball beneath him was Genevieve, shivering. "Jen." Finn pulled her out of Max's arms and rubbed his hands quickly against her arms. "Come on, Jenny, talk to me." Genevieve shuddered and squinted against the sudden onslaught of movement. Finn. "Stay awake, Jen, don't you go to sleep on me." "Come on, Max, get up." Finn hauled Genevieve into his arms and held her close as a strong wind hit them square in the face. He turned to protect Genevieve. What little warmth Max had preserved beneath his wings had quickly dissipated and she shuddered in his arms, face pressed into the crook of his neck. He faced the dragons again to see Max struggling to his feet. "That's it, come on. It's not far." Max growled and shuddered, but finally managed to get to all fours. Zap came alongside him and tucked her head beneath his chin, raising it higher. Keeping his focus up. "Good." Finn allowed himself only seconds to marvel at his dragon's instincts before moving. It was slow moving, slower than even before, and though their tracks were already half buried, they would have been lost without them. Zap and Max easily outpaced Finn, but they didn't let him out of their sight as they slowly, so painfully slowly made it back to the clearing that led to the Haddock house. When it finally came into view, dark against the onslaught of cold, Finn's legs almost buckled. He leaned against Zap and grit his teeth, praying for strength. They were so close. Genevieve shuddered in his arms. Somehow it spurred him onward until he stumbled up the porch stairs. His hands were shaking inside his gloves, but he finally got the door open. He tripped on the threshold and they crashed to the floor. Genevieve groaned as Finn quickly sat up. Sorry. He stumbled to his feet and grabbed a handful of wood from beneath the stairs. Making a fire first was imperative, even though he needed to get the dragons inside the barn and start a fire before they both got sick and died. One thing at a time. Focus. It took a few minutes, but he finally got a fire started in the pit. The flames crackled against the wood as smoke wafted upward through the chimney. Finn's hands shook, but he forced his focus on Genevieve, who weakly sat up and crawled toward the flames. She was moving on her own, which was a good sign, her blue lips, though, not so much. Take your coat off, Finn said, already pulling at the buttons of her coat. Genevieve looked down in confusion and realized it was sopping wet. Oh. Yes. Stay by the fire. As she took over with the buttons, Finn climbed to his feet and stumbled back outside. The shockjaws were standing just outside the barn, Zap's head still tucked beneath Max's. They both shuddered with cold. Max looked dead on his feet, but was clearly trying to stay awake. Finn stumbled to the door and found ice covering the locks. Come on, Finn breathed on the metal heavily, trying to crack the ice. Zap. She was already there and blew a hot blast of air onto the locks. Finn scrubbed away the ice as it cracked, his gloves sticking to the icy metal. Finally he undid the lock and yanked it off before dragging the doors open. It was barely wide enough for the two dragons to fit through, but he followed them in and shut the doors. He set about making another fire as Max crashed into the nearest bed of hay. A new type of cloud erupted as the hay flew in all directions and Finn covered his nose to keep from sneezing. It did little to help and he ended up sneezing twice anyway. Or perhaps that was the shudders racking his own body from the cold. He shook his head and forced himself to focus as Zap crooned and cuddled up next to Max as he began to shudder. The fire crackled in the forge that his father used for his own tinkering. It wasn't long before the barn glowed with a warm orange glow and the temperature rose considerably. He'd have to come out to stoke the forge every few hours, but this would help. Finn crept over to the dragons and surveyed Max's condition. He was still shaking with cold, but Zap would help with that. His wings didn't look damaged from what he could see. The ice and snow had already melted off. All right, will you guys be okay? Zap crooned and draped a wing over Max's back. His deep blue eyes slowly shut, lulled to sleep by her breathing. Finn bent down and kissed Zap between the eyes. Thank you. I know that wasn't easy. Zap exhaled through her nose as if to say, you're welcome, and closed her eyes. Satisfied, Finn took that as his cue to leave. He shut the barn doors behind him firmly and trudged back to the house. It felt colder now, though he wasn't sure if that was the temperature dropping, or if he'd gotten used to the warmth of the barn. When he shoved his way inside and locked the door behind him, he found Genevieve huddled up beside the fire, which crackled with warmth and cast an orange glow through the otherwise empty house. Her hair and clothes were wet, her skin pale with cold, though her cheeks and hands were bright red. Finn yanked off his wet coat and boots and dropped them by the door. Dropping to his knees beside Genevieve, he pulled her in close to his chest. Genevieve shifted, surprise and confusion written all over her face. What are you? We have to get warm, Finn said. Her ear was like a block of ice on his cheek and he cupped his hands over both of them, pressing her face into his neck. We're both too cold and wet. We'll get hypothermia. Genevieve's hands were shaking as they slowly twined around his back. Suddenly, it was as if nothing had changed. Like they were cuddling on a cold winter's day, just as they had a year ago. The only thing missing were a few cups of steaming cider and a book, some blankets, and stolen kisses in the dark. Finn shut down the memories and focused on his survival instincts. Touching her, missing her, the hurt he still felt, the unsaid words between them, those things didn't matter right now. All that mattered was making sure she didn't get sick overnight. How long they sat there in each other's embrace, their bodies slowly thawing out beside the fire, he wasn't sure. But eventually her ears weren't so cold beneath his palms and her nose wasn't so icy against his neck as she slowly, stiffly raised her head to meet his eyes. With her hair still damp beneath his hands, he could easily brush those loose curls out of her eyes like he always used to. Gentle for her, only for her. Genevieve's voice was dry when she said, "You found me." No, Zap found her. If it weren't for his dragon, he'd still be out there looking. He wouldn't stop, but he knew the bitter truth, cold and deadly. He wouldn't have found her. And he would have died out there, too. Finn didn't voice these thoughts. Instead, he retracted his hands and got to his feet, ignoring the concerned look in her eyes. "I'll see if I can find you some clothes." "Where?" Genevieve cleared her throat and swallowed. He'd have to make them both hot drinks before long. "Where is everyone?" "The Great Hall," Finn said. This feigned calm wasn't working. By the second, he could feel the anxiety rising in his chest. He didn't want to run away, but he needed a moment. "Stay there. I'll be back." He made it halfway up the stairs before she said, "Finn." He paused and waited, closing his eyes against the onslaught of emotions that came surging up at her voice, her tone, her nearness. He wasn't ready for this. He'd never be ready for it. "You saved my life. Again. Thank you." Finn opened his eyes and swallowed. "No problem." He continued up the stairs and didn't stop until there were 2 floors between them. He shut the attic door and leaned against it, forced himself to take a deep breath. It was too much. There were too many emotions. The terror, the panic, the anger and frustration, all directed at her. She'd almost died tonight and all she could do was thank him for saving her. She'd been so close to the house and she'd given up then. Finn huffed, scrubbing at his face. That wasn't fair. He'd nearly given up a few times on that walk. Granted, he'd been carrying another person and keeping track of 2 dragons, but that was beside the point. He'd only been outside for perhaps half an hour. She'd been out there for hours. This was exactly the reason why he'd never wanted her to visit last winter. He didn't want to lose her to a storm. She'd likely only survived by her wits and Max's intuition in the blizzard. Was he still mad about it? Hell, yes. But she'd made it to Burke. And now they were stuck here for the night, perhaps longer. He didn't know how long this storm would last, but at minimum, it would last the night. They'd have to spend the night together. How were they going to manage that without talking about the breakup? Anxiety coiled in his stomach so tightly that he thought he'd vomit. He took a deep breath through his nose and let it out. Clothes. She needed clothes. Not a sappy ex-boyfriend who couldn't get a grip. And no matter what she wanted to discuss, he knew she'd have her way. He couldn't exactly run from it or avoid it. They were well and truly stuck here. He just hoped, as he dug out a few chests containing Adriana's old clothes, that Genevieve wouldn't kick a man already down. Finn was upset. The problem though, wasn't that he was upset. In fact, he had every reason, multiple reasons, actually, to be upset. The problem was that she couldn't fathom what to do to fix things or where to begin. He was silent as he flurried through the house, his expression set, blue eyes hard. Walls thrown up, then. She wondered if the cold front was because of her or for his own benefit. Was he detaching himself to hide his emotions or because he was overwhelmed? Both. Regardless, he'd yet to change out of his own wet clothes. He full out glared as she tried to leave the fire, offering to make tea. The stubborn set of his jaw brooked no argument. She wasn't going anywhere until he was satisfied that she was all right. Ergo, he was being a mother hen, but given the circumstances, he had every right to be. Truth be told, she was so cold she could hardly feel her hands, her limbs. The cold had seeped deep into her bones, and it would take a lot of effort to peel herself off the floor. A deep feeling of shame swept through her. Of course he was upset. She could have died out there. No, she and Max would have died. It had been so cold that she'd slowly lost feeling to her extremities. It had been such a long, cold flight, and when they entered the storm, they'd gotten so turned around that she'd had little hope of finding their way out again. Luckily, Max's nose was just as good as Zap's. They'd made it to Burke. But his exhaustion was imminent. When he'd nearly collapsed in the snow, Genevieve had not dared to leave him. It seemed painfully cruel to leave him alone, and the odds were stacked against her. It was highly unlikely that she'd find anyone to save her, let alone go back and find Max again before it was too late. She stared into the flames, relishing the heat, but it wasn't enough. Though she tried to fight it, she shivered and buried her face against her cold, wet knees. It could have been a few minutes or it could have been an hour, but she woke to a pair of warm hands landing on her shoulders. Hey, Finn shook her gently. Come on. Genevieve felt distinctly wobble-kneed as she tried to stand, but she was so cold, she thought she might faint. Finn frowned, and before she knew it, he'd hooked an arm under her knees and hauled her into his arms. I found you some clothes, but I want you to take a bath first to warm up. I've already stoked the heaters in here, so it shouldn't be long for the water to heat up, Finn said, setting her on a bench in the washroom. He pointed at the various cabinets. Towels, soap, whatever you need is in there. And clothes are there. He nodded to a bench nearby with a rather large stack of clothes. Hopefully something fits. They used to be Adriana's before she got pregnant. I assume you'll be alright. Though she trembled, she certainly would not ask for his assistance getting into the bath. She would not lose her dignity so easily. Yes, thank you. Finn nodded once and moved toward the door, but not before Genevieve grabbed his arm. Finn, we need to talk. Finn didn't look at her, though his shoulders were tight. Just get warm, General. We'll talk later. He gently pulled his arm away and strode from the room, gently closing the door behind him. Genevieve stared after him, listening to his footsteps on the stairs until they faded away. He'd likely retreated to his own room to change. She'd never seen him like this. Withdrawn, quiet, tense. But wasn't this exactly what his friends and family had told her about? This was all her fault. Sighing, she observed the series of knobs and levers above the washtub. Hiccup had once shown her how they worked. A small inscription was on each knob, and she squinted until she saw one labeled H and the other C. Hot and cold, then. She figured it out quickly from there and smiled at Hiccup's ingenuity. His handiwork was everywhere. It was too bad he couldn't figure out a heating system for the house, or the entire village might not have to hole up in the Great Hall at times like this. It was difficult work, stripping the sopping wet clothes from her body. Each piece landed on the floor with a wet slap, and before long, she was trembling. Her teeth chattered in the silence, no matter how hard she tried to fight it. With her luck, Finn would hear them and come charging downstairs to help her after all. If it meant the difference between her sickness or her health, he would suck it up and do it. She refused the thought and carefully descended into the tub, hissing at the heat of the water. She'd learned not to make the water too hot from her experience getting frostbite last year. Though her skin prickled, especially her fingers and toes, it didn't take long to acclimate to the warmth. Soon enough she was adding more hot water, savoring the heat. A small wicker basket caught her eye on a nearby shelf containing small bottles and salts. Her brows shot up into her hairline and wondered if Astrid would mind. Minutes later, the room smelled of eucalyptus, while the water had turned a milky white from the bubbles and salts she'd added. She relaxed into the water and took a deep, calming breath. Already her head felt clearer. As she washed and picked the knots out of her hair, she considered the reason she was here, the boy upstairs. She'd hurt him deeply. She wanted to fix it. Her pride and misunderstanding gave her no right to wound him the way she did. She just hoped and prayed he'd give her a chance to mend things. And then, well, she didn't know what would happen next. She scrubbed the bubbles out of her hair and pulled the plug out of the bottom of the washtub. As the water drained, she strained as much water out of her hair as she could, and then reached for the plush towel. While the room was warm from the hot water, it was still drafty enough that she dried off quickly and reached for the pile of clothes. The stack was full of various clothing, some of which were intended for summer use, like skirts or tank tops. She wondered why he'd grabbed so much variety. And then she discovered the underthings buried in the middle. Despite herself, Genevieve stifled a snort. It didn't take much to imagine Finn hiding the items in the middle of the pile to prevent awkwardness. Rummaging through the pile, she refused to think oddly of it. All of her things were wet, so she would have to make do until they dried. His thoughtfulness was sweet, even with the awkwardness hovering over them like a cloud. Still, as she dressed she quickly realized that she and Adriana were not the same size in the bra department, even prior to Adriana's pregnancy, so she left those in the pile. But, looking down at herself in the loose long-sleeved wool shirt, she certainly could not walk around like this. It was hardly appropriate. Her eyes settled on a familiar sweatshirt folded in a clean laundry basket nearby. At first she hesitated at borrowing Finn's sweatshirt, given their current situation, but she wasn't about to make things more uncomfortable. Without another thought, Genevieve grabbed the blue sweatshirt and pulled it on. It was thick and warm and much too big for her small frame, but it covered her up properly. She couldn't even tell the difference in the mirror. After hanging up her wet clothes and the borrowed towel, Genevieve pulled her damp hair into a low tail and observed her reflection. She was pale, but her lips had returned to their usual rose pink. A moment of fear kept her rooted to the spot, but she stamped it out. She couldn't stay in here forever. As her mother always said, time to face the music. So steeling her nerves, she straightened and left the washroom. The smell of something warm and hearty filled her nose. Finn sat in the living room, scooping chopped vegetables into a pot that bubbled over the fire. He paused when he saw her, his blue eyes flicking down to his sweatshirt. I'm still a little cold. Genevieve stammered, lifting her hands awkwardly. The sleeves were so long, her fingers were barely visible. The shirt fits, but it's thin. With the way he watched her, she wondered if he'd make her take it off. Surely there were other sweatshirts she could borrow that didn't belong to him. Wearing his clothes was naturally a more intimate part of their relationship. Well, their past relationship. After a long moment, his chin dipped in a single nod and he returned to stirring the pot. Genevieve breathed a silent sigh of relief. She was overthinking it. He wouldn't be that cruel and it was chilly in here. If he noticed any particular items of clothing missing, he didn't mention it. Not that he would anyway, she reasoned. If he noticed, he'd probably blush or... Stop, Genevieve thought and took a deep breath through her nose. She tiptoed around the couch and took a seat beside him, feeling distinctly, tragically awkward. They'd had a few awkward moments in their time before dating, even after their relationship had officially begun. But, nothing like this. They'd never had a difficult time talking, but now it felt close to impossible. Genevieve slowly raised her eyes. His own were firmly on the stew as he stirred, but everything looked properly mixed to her. Not that she was an expert on cooking, but she wasn't that dense. At least he'd changed clothes. His hair was mussed and slightly damp, like he'd run a towel through it. She could see a portion of the slave mark at his temple but didn't dare mention it or move to cover it like she used to. In fact, she didn't feel comfortable touching him at all, like it would be a breach of comfort. He was coiled tightly enough to show his discomfort, despite pretending that she wasn't sitting right beside him. Though she knew she'd have to be the one to break the silence, she found no joy in it. But they couldn't sit here in silence forever and she had come here to talk to him. They were alone and there would be no interruptions. There was no time like the present. We don't seem to have much luck in the winter seasons, do we? Genevieve asked quietly, a hint of amusement in her voice. Or maybe that's just me. Finn was quiet for so long, she didn't think he would reply. And then he said, yeah, you do have quite the track record. His blue eyes flicked to hers. How many times is that now that I've saved you from a frozen death? Genevieve fought a smile. I assure you, I have not once done it intentionally. Aha! Finn said, fighting a smile of his own. You sure know how to get a guy's attention. Well, Genevieve paused, considering. Wait, how did you know that I was out there? The amusement faded from Finn's expression. Thuggery followed you. When he got to the Great Hall and you weren't there. A hint of irritation appeared then, and he dropped the ladle into the pot with a clank. You do know you scared me to death, right? Thuggery, he followed me. Genevieve felt a mix of fear and irritation. I left a note. Good thing too, or you'd be dead right now. True. So very true. When she'd been huddled under Max, hearing nothing but the howling of the wind and his labored breathing, felt nothing but his shivers and the frozen tundra of the ground beneath her. She thought they were done. "I'm sorry," she whispered. I wanted to talk to you and I left so abruptly. If I'd waited, I probably would have heard there was a storm coming, but I didn't stop to talk." "Gods," Finn dropped his face into his hands. "Have you forgotten your training already?" "No, I made a stupid decision. You always check with the sailors before long flights." "I know, but Thuggery said your dad visited and mentioned that with the coming winter, our villages might get stranded for the season, and I didn't want to risk not seeing you for months." "So you did know there was a storm coming?" "No, I didn't," Genevieve insisted. "If I'd looked for the signs, or talked to someone like I should have, then I would have known. But my mind was made up, so I left quickly. I didn't want to waste another moment. I want to talk to you about everything." Finn's irritated expression turned guarded. "Promise me something." Her heart fluttered in her chest. "Anything. Don't ever make that flight again without talking to the sailors and your parents first." Genevieve nodded. "I promise. I'm very sorry that I scared you." They were silent for a long moment, a moment in which he stirred the bubbling stew again and she gathered her thoughts. "Is Thuggery all right?" "I'm sure he's fine. I left the Great Hall before I noticed any injuries, but he seemed all right." She was glad she was sitting, or the relief might have made her knees crumple. "Good." Once again, they fell into a tense silence. She knew what she needed to do, what she needed to say, but it wouldn't be easy. Even after everything that had happened leading up to this moment, she should just spit it out. Before she could decide, Finn abruptly stood. "Soup's ready." He padded to the kitchen and retrieved a few bowls and spoons. "Do you want anything to drink?" "Tea." Genevieve walked to the cabinet that she knew held tea and Hiccup's coffee, and paused at the large assortment. She herself had brought many of these over from her own stash at home, so that if she wanted anything specific, it would be here. She'd practically moved in. "Do you want some?" Finn snorted. "Tea is hardly strong enough for a day like this." "Well, you could do with a calming brew." He hummed in agreement, but she only made herself a cup. No doubt he wouldn't take more than a few sips of the leaf water, so she wouldn't waste it. In minutes they settled back into the couch cushions with their bowls of stew, her tea steaming on the stones of the fire pit, and a mug of what she assumed was mulled cider for him. Finn stretched out his long legs toward the flames and dug in with so much gusto, she couldn't tell if he was starving or merely distracting himself. She didn't comment and dug in, and quickly hid her surprise. Normally his food was flavorful and well seasoned, but the stew was quite bland. "It wasn't bad, but I know, it needs salt," Finn said, shoveling another spoonful into his mouth. "But we ran out a few days ago and my mom didn't have time to grab more, what with the storm." Genevieve nodded. "Well, it's still much better than anything I can make." Finn rolled his eyes. "Your cooking isn't that bad. Just because you forced down those rock-hard biscuits doesn't mean they were enjoyable. Anything is possible if you add enough jelly." Genevieve laughed, and then elbowed him before she could help herself. She paused, wondering at the exchange and his expression. Sad but hopeful, maybe. He didn't return the gesture as he usually did, however, and she quietly returned to her stew. The rest of the meal passed in silence. When they were finished, he gathered up their bowls and deposited them in the kitchen. Apparently there was no water in the bucket, as it had been dumped before the haddocks vacated the house, and the well outside would be impossible to locate, and it was likely frozen over besides. Therefore, Finn had nothing else to distract himself with, and yet she watched over the back of the couch as he began straightening the various odds and ends in the cabinets. Stalling. Genevieve set down her tea and stood. "Finn. We need to talk about this." Though he pursed his lips and didn't cease putting the various spices in alphabetical order, he nodded. "Fire away." Refusing to let him pretend otherwise, Genevieve stepped between him and the cabinet, close enough that their chests brushed. Surprised, Finn looked down at her, as if he hadn't expected her to get so close. But she knew him well, well enough to know that while they needed to have this conversation, he was afraid and did not want to have it, and so she would have to be the one to start it. She wouldn't let him ignore her all night. And judging by the tightening of his jaw, he knew it too. A battle of wills. I can't try to mend things if you keep stubbornly avoiding it, Genevieve said unflinchingly. There wouldn't be anything to fix if you hadn't broken it. I know. After a few tense moments of silence, Finn shrugged. So? Genevieve licked her lips. Why didn't you tell me it was years ago? Finn's expression shuddered and he stepped away. After everything, you still want to pin it on me? No, that's not it at all. But maybe if you'd told me right then and there that it was years ago, I would have. What? You would have what? Finn demanded. You were angry and upset, and I understand why. Don't think for one second that I don't understand the gravity of the situation when I've dreaded that moment since the day it happened. Genevieve held up her hands. Maybe I would have understood, or at least calmed down and let you explain. You didn't want to hear it, so don't act like this is my fault. But. No buts, Genevieve. You broke up with me, not the other way around. Has it still not occurred to you that I never told you about Rain because I'm not proud of what happened? I understand that now, Genevieve pleaded. I was wrong to break things off. I was wrong for so many things, but at the time, I had no idea. You've been acting so strangely that I thought you were cheating on me. Finn shook his head in confusion. I haven't been acting strangely. Oh yeah? Genevieve asked. Then where else have you been going besides Birkenjet? I what? Finn asked, the anger clearing from his expression almost instantly. Did you think I wouldn't notice? Genevieve asked. It started out small when you'd show up late, but it became hours, sometimes even the morning after, and you'd increasingly arrive looking exhausted. Sometimes you smelled like smoke and Zach was obviously exhausted from flying. So you obviously have been going somewhere else. Finn looked utterly shocked. It took a few minutes for him to recover, but then he shook his head and said, so you automatically assume I've been cheating on you? You're avoiding the question, and no, I didn't automatically assume anything, but I knew something was off. And yet when you saw Rain you couldn't just leave it alone. That's not fair, Genevieve said. Any upstanding girlfriend would want to know who the mystery girl talking to her boyfriend is. Yes, but any upstanding girlfriend wouldn't assume that her boyfriend is up to no good either. The upstanding girlfriend wouldn't have to make assumptions if he'd just tell her the truth. Why is it so hard to understand that I don't want to talk about it? It, being Rain, or your mysterious adventures to who knows where? Finn growled in frustration before stalking away. Genevieve watched him go and opted to keep her distance as he took a deep breath and seemed to be fighting for patience. Finally, he turned toward her again. This doesn't change the fact that Adriana told you that my relationship with Rain, if you can even call it that, was 3 years ago. I understand that it didn't look good when she showed up, and it was just my luck that you were already mad at me. I can understand and even forgive you for those things. But what I can't seem to wrap my head around is that after Adriana told you the truth, you still acted like I'd done something to hurt you. Genevieve swallowed. I needed time to think. What else is there to think about? Finn demanded. I didn't cheat on you. Simple enough, right? My emotions were all over the place. I needed time to get my head on straight. I didn't realize that was such a crime. You could have told me that. And string you along, in case Genevieve faltered. Finn stared. In case what? In case you really didn't want to fix things after all. Genevieve shook her head, but the damage was done. He shook his head and put another foot of space between them. Have you been doubting us all this time? No. Genevieve cursed herself for constantly overthinking everything, for planting scenarios into her own mind, so now she only confused him more. She closed her eyes and cleared her mind. No, I should not have said that. Finn's laugh was bitter. No, maybe it's the first honest thing you've said to me in a long time. No, shut up, you stubborn idiot, I want to fix this. Genevieve raised a hand to stop him from interrupting. It was hard for me to reconcile myself with the fact that you've been with someone else. Finn made a face. I've had other girlfriends before and you never seemed to have a problem. Genevieve felt her face grow warm. Have you slept with all of them? Finn's expression hardened and he crossed his arms tightly over his chest. All right. If you seem to know the whole story, then why don't you tell me? Adriana said that she didn't know the details. For a reason, Finn said bitterly. So I don't see why you, or anyone else, should have to. I understand that, but it matters to me. Why? Because I wanted to marry you, Finn. That effectively shut him up. Again, the anger on his face dissipated and was replaced with surprise. I wanted to marry you, Genevieve said, stepping closer. Because I wanted to be the first, and the only girl, you took to bed someday. You are the only one I have wanted to spend my life with. I have not doubted that once because you've never given me a reason to. Until you started disappearing. She stared into those blue eyes she loved so much. And always held back when we kissed. And when it was so obvious that you were hiding something with that girl. Despite herself, her eyes burned. Finn's eyes held a devastated look. It's not what you think. Genevieve blinked, fighting the tears. Then tell me. She gripped his shirt as he looked away. Tell me. Huffing, not with frustration, but resignation, Finn rubbed his face. Gods, this is all so messed up. Then explain it to me. Genevieve whispered. Please. He was silent for a few minutes before running a hand down his face. His eyes darted between hers. I'm going to tell you two things and I want you to listen closely. 1. Rain and I, we never. He paused, and she watched as a flush rose up his neck. We never had sex. We spent the night together and we did things, but Rain wanted to stop and we did. But. Genevieve's mind whirled with the implications, but her thoughts snagged on the final word. But. That's the second thing, and it applies to two scenarios, Finn said in a dull voice. I never wanted to stop. Genevieve stared back, confused. What do you mean? With Rain, she was an outlet, something for me to use to fill the emptiness I felt at all the things I'd done. Finn's voice was low and he kept his eyes averted. He exhaled heavily, as if hoping it would help get the words out. If Rain hadn't stopped us, I sure wasn't going to. It was the only thing I had left to destroy in my already sad, lonely life. The pain in his eyes wasn't faked. Genevieve swallowed, even as she applied this part of the story to the rest of the narrative, filling in the gaps that he'd omitted. And, the other scenario. The fog cleared from his eyes as their eyes met. Whenever we kissed, I never wanted to stop. Genevieve remembered the eagerness of his hands, his mouth, how much he said he wanted to please her. She'd always thought that in the heat of the moment, he might just want her as much as she wanted him. Many times, she'd been ready to beg for it. And then he would pull away with guilt in his eyes. He would set her aflame and then leave her to burn. He could rile her up so quickly, and he seemed to enjoy doing so, just to end things open-ended, leaving her unsatisfied and frustrated. So Genevieve murmured, reeling with the information. You never stopped because you regretted it. Never. Gently setting his hands on her waist, Finn turned them until her back was pressed against the wall. Her heart ratcheted into her chest at the sudden contact, the sudden heat in his gaze. If you knew the things that sometimes go through my head, the things that I want to do to you, Finn whispered, so soft that heat spread through her limbs, her torso. Well, virtuous is not exactly one of the first words that come to mind. Despite herself and the pounding in her core, Genevieve stifled a giggle. But Finn said, firmly. That is exactly the problem. That is exactly what happened when I met Rain. I found myself wanting and giving in and taking things that were not mine. Even if she gave it freely, I was not in the right place for that. I was young and immature and controlling. I thought I'd just killed Eric. I ran away from home. Again. In my mind, I had nothing to lose. Genevieve stared, the searing heat fleeing at the pain in his voice. But with you, I had so much to lose, Finn whispered, brushing a curl out of her eyes. And everything to gain. If I could just control myself and not be so lustful and possessive, maybe I could make it. Maybe I could handle it. He smiled then, shaking his head and leaning so close their foreheads touched. But gods, you are so beautiful and amazing and downright dirty sometimes, that it's next to impossible to keep my head on straight when I'm around you. It was so difficult to share breath and to feel every inch of him pressing into her, but she forced herself to stay on track. So, that's why you would stop. Because you didn't want to make the same mistake twice. Finn nodded. I don't want to live with that guilt. I don't think I could look your father in the face if. He closed his eyes and sighed through his nose. I don't want my desires to get the best of me like that ever again. And you haven't, you didn't. Genevieve hated the way her face heated. Mercifully, he shook his head. Why do you think I pull away so much when I get too worked up? It would be too easy to give in and indulge, and it might feel great in the moment. But I don't want to regret it. Never with you. A warmth that had nothing to do with desire spread through her chest. Genevieve slid a hand up his chest until she could feel his heart hammering. I was wrong. In many ways, I was so wrong. Her eyes burned again. I'm so sorry for yelling at you and embarrassing you. I'm sorry for everything. I'm sorry too, he said quietly, expression bleak. Maybe someday I would have told you. No, you don't have to make excuses. It was none of my business. Genevieve waited until his eyes met hers again and forced herself not to balk under his gaze no matter how much her heart clenched. Will you forgive me? She could tell that it still hurt, that there were still words between them that he'd yet to voice. Maybe he had every right to stay angry. Perhaps the fearless Finn everyone had told her about would never trust her again. She'd ruined everything, and now forced him to relive some of his darkest memories. As soon as the storm was over, he would send her packing, just like she deserved. Finn must have seen the fear because his expression softened. Yes. I love you, Jenny. I want to make this work. More than you can possibly know. Relief washed over her. Genevieve twined her arms around his neck and squeezed tightly, even as he banded his arms around her back, even lifted her off her feet. He pressed his face into her neck and sighed, almost as if releasing a burden he'd been carrying for years. She'd been so afraid, based on the things she'd been told by his friends and family, that it was truly over. That she'd finally come to her senses and would try to fix things, and he wouldn't give her a chance. She'd been told that he hardly forgave an offense if it struck hard enough. But maybe they were wrong. Or perhaps, more likely, they didn't realize just how far he'd come. It might still be painfully difficult for him to forgive and let go, but he was not so stubborn and selfish that he would permanently end their relationship. He loved her more than that. And that was true love, wasn't it? Forgiveness. Genevieve squeezed him tighter. I love you. And the next time something happens, I promise to let you explain. To her surprise, Finn laughed. Babe, I'm fresh out of secrets. I've got nothing else. She pulled back, surprised. Really? Finn lowered her back to the ground, slowly so that she slid down his body. Really? But if I think of anything, I'll hold you to that promise. Good. Genevieve cleared her throat. And I'll try to control myself as well. At his blink, she added, so I don't tempt you. Even though he gave her a rogue smile, he brushed the curls off her face and kissed her forehead. Much appreciated. He pulled back just enough to meet her eyes again. So, we're good. Genevieve twined her fingers through his and kissed his palm. Yes. Relief flooded his face as he leaned in, and then his mouth was on hers. Genevieve savored the touch, the gentle pull of his lips. She stood on tiptoes and pulled him even closer, not caring that she could hardly breathe. Marry me, Finn whispered onto her lips. Genevieve gasped for breath. What? Marry me, Finn said again. Let's make it official. Well, we're missing a few key elements at the moment. No, not right now. Finn, you're not making sense. I mean, let's talk about it, figure out a plan. Gods know everyone will want to be there for the event. We might as well start planning early. Finn slid his hands up her back and exhaled. Bottom line is, I love you, and I never want to be separated again. I know we can't logistically get married right now and I'm not asking for that, but I want to talk to your dad. I don't even have a ring yet, so I'll do it right, but I want you to marry me. Genevieve bit her lip, fighting the grin. She wanted to leap for the joy in her heart, but resisted. She pretended to think. Ask me again. Properly. Finn's brows rose a fraction of an inch before he smirked. Still holding her hands, he took a single step back and then got down one knee. Genevieve Sullivan, I would be truly honored if you would give me formal permission to ask you to marry me sometime in the near future. Genevieve laughed, the sound echoing through the room. That's not exactly what I had in mind. Hey, I can't do a whole speech without a ring. Shaking her head, Genevieve squeezed his hands. Yes, I would be honored to give you formal permission to ask me to marry you sometime in the near future. Excellent. Finn moved to stand, but paused when she raised a hand. What? Oh, nothing. Genevieve cocked her head. I just like this view on you. Bowing before your queen. Finn choked on a laugh, but it was quickly interrupted when she dropped to her knees and kissed him firmly. Soon hands were roaming, mouths claiming in rapid movements, his teeth scraping against her neck. I thought, oh gods, Genevieve moaned when his hand slid up the back of her shirt and palmed her bare back. I thought we were going to be good. We are, Finn said, pulling her into his lap and kissing the soft skin below her ear. But I figured we could make up for lost time, just a little bit. And besides, he whispered, his hand sliding around her waist and reaching upwards. It's not every day a man's beautiful girlfriend crawls into his lap braless. Oh gods, Genevieve slammed her hand atop his, even though it was trapped beneath the thick sweatshirt. His fingers were warm against her stomach as she leaned in closer. Save the goods for the wedding night. Finn smirked and slid his hand back around her waist. Whatever my lady says. He kissed her again, firmer, slower, though his fingers didn't stop their tantalizing slide up her back. You're enjoying this, aren't you? She inhaled shakily. Hey, you've had your hands all over me on multiple occasions. Which won't be happening again anytime soon, I assure you. Exactly, Finn purred, burying his face in her neck and squeezing her close. So let me enjoy this moment. Genevieve's eyes fell shut, her breath all too loud in her ears. There had been times his hand would sneak up the back of her shirt, but those were teasing touches, sometimes daring in the right setting. But this was slow, intentional, tantalizing. Gods, she wanted nothing more than for those hands to be everywhere. She squirmed when his fingers traced her sides and he laughed into her neck, his voice rough. See how difficult it is to not lose your mind. We're. Genevieve cleared her throat. We're certainly not making this easy. Not at all. Mercifully, he pulled his hands out of the shirt altogether and banded his arms around her waist. He sighed and gazed at her with a happy smile, but she could still see it. The lingering sadness, as if he couldn't quite believe all that had happened. Genevieve leaned forward and kissed him gently. I missed you. Finn closed his eyes and whispered, promise you'll never leave me like that again. Genevieve touched his face and waited until their eyes met. Never again. I promise. She wrapped her arms around his neck and squeezed. She'd prove it to him. She'd never hurt him like that again. From now on, there were no more secrets, no more. She stiffened. Wait. Finn looked confused when she sat up and crossed her arms. You still haven't told me where you've been going off to. I thought you said there were no more secrets. Oh. His blue eyes went wide. That was I meant I didn't have any more secrets from my childhood, not, crap. There had better be a good explanation for this, mister. There is, Finn said quickly. There is. But you can't tell anyone, General, not my parents, Anna and Eric, your family, nobody. Nobody knows about this. It can't get out. Not yet. Genevieve was surprised by his insistence, but she nodded. Whatever it is, I won't tell a soul. I promise. Finn scanned her face before nodding slowly. Okay. Then listen carefully. Chapter 6, Complex Misgivings. Chapter text. While Eric loved playing with his son, he did not fancy the sensation of Darren's tiny, dagger-like nails digging into his skin. For the third time, he unfurled the tiny fingers latching onto his wrist. Hey, we've talked about this. Eric said, hissing through his teeth. All blue eyes and blonde hair, Darren stared up at him, toys scattered before him momentarily forgotten, and grinned. 4 white teeth shone in the mid-morning light. Don't laugh at me, mister. It's not funny. Eric winced and pulled his arm out of reach. Okay, but really, that does hurt. Darren didn't seem bothered, his hands instead locating a colorful ring, complete with teeth marks in the rubber. Eric wondered how it didn't hurt his teeth and gums to chew on such a hard material. It was better than Eric's own fingers at any rate. Being a dad was a blast. Sure, the late-night feedings and diaper changes weren't exactly pleasurable, but he didn't care. In fact, he couldn't fathom how some husbands didn't voluntarily care for their children during the night and allow their wives more rest. Surely it was a two-person job, the welfare of children. Therefore, at least to him, it was only fair that he share the workload. Well, in the areas he could share anyway. He couldn't exactly feed Darren if the need arose. Regardless, Eric would gladly stay home every day to play with his son. He knew his responsibility was to work so he could put food on the table, but Horst was gracious and sometimes allowed him to leave early. He'd be forever grateful for such good friends and family who allowed him and Adriana time to go on dates or simply spend time with Darren. While they might be parents, they were still young newlyweds and figuring out adulting, as Cliff liked to call it. They didn't want life's responsibilities to take precedence, which would result in a stagnant marriage. Which was exactly why Eric had planned a fun night out on the town with his wife for their first anniversary. Eric caught sight of Adriana as she swept from one room to the next, humming to herself as she worked. He wasn't exactly sure what she was doing, but it didn't matter. He loved seeing her flit through their new house. It still smelled of fresh pine and had the distinct new house feeling. While they'd been organizing and putting things away, it still had so much extra room that it almost felt empty. At last they were sorting through the boxes of things they'd been gifted from their wedding and the baby shower. At last, everything had a place, and with room to spare to fill for, well, for what he didn't know yet. Life, he supposed. Everything was finally coming together. A year had already passed since they'd gotten married. They had a son. What more could he ask for? And just what are you smiling at? Eric turned in his seat as Adriana walked in, her slippered feet scuffing against the floorboards. He wrapped an arm around her waist and said, "Nothing. Just glad to be home with my family." Adriana tried, and failed, to hide a smile. Dork. She brushed a hand through his hair and smiled at Darren, who held up the rubber ring as if offering her to take a bite. "Oh, no thank you. Daddy's spit is the only kind I like to share." Eric snorted and squeezed her waist until she wiggled out of his hold. "You do say such naughty things in front of our son, Annie." "Well, he doesn't know any better," Adriana said. "Besides, maybe he won't grow up thinking affection is awkward if he sees it growing up." "Affection," sure, Eric shrugged. "But saying naughty things is different. Every parent loves to make their kid blush, or such has been my experience. He'll learn to love it. Trial by fire, kiddo." Eric laughed as Adriana gave him a push, but it quickly died when she stepped over his legs and settled in his lap, wrapping her hands around his neck. "Not wasting any time, huh? Not on our anniversary," Adriana said before kissing him. Even a year later, he thought he'd never tire of her. He thought he'd loved her before they got married, before they had Darren, before they moved into their new house. But as each day passed and he saw how she handled the hard work of managing a house and Darren, how she dealt with his long hours, and somehow found time to visit others or help with other projects, all with Darren in tow, he couldn't help but love her more. It wasn't perfect. They'd had more arguments over silly things than he could possibly count. They'd had a few serious arguments that ended in tears and frustration. At the end of each day though, they were still a team. They still loved each other. That was all that mattered. Just as Adriana deepened the kiss and effectively set his blood on simmer, a knock sounded at the door. Their lips separated with a loud pop as she stood, disentangling herself from the circle of his arms. "I wonder who that is," she mused, striding to the door as if she hadn't just exited the land of euphoria. Which was exactly where Eric was, and tried to not sound too frustrated as he cleared his throat. Darin had abandoned the ring and was now straining to reach a plush Night Fury. Eric pushed it closer as Adriana opened the door. Hey! Adriana opened the door wider to reveal Finn and Genevieve. Eric's heart gave a lurch and he faced Darin again. What are you guys doing here? I wanted to see the house. Genevieve said, taking a turn about the room. Oh, it's beautiful. Thank you. Eric twisted in his chair, unable to fight the rush of pride as they wandered down the hall to inspect the other rooms. Finn dropped into a seat beside him, snorting at the sight of Darin eating the toothless toy. It's spacious, it's warm and cozy, Adriana said. What more could a girl ask for? Maybe some rugs. Genevieve said, eyeing the naked floor as they returned. Perhaps I'll make you one. I, for one, Finn said, nodding toward the living room, am jealous of that fireplace. I could marry that thing. The girls snorted, even as they observed the massive fireplace built of grey stones, complete with a wide mantel. It would hold massive fires to warm the large living space. Eric didn't say it out loud, but he'd specifically wanted a huge fireplace and mantel just for the pleasure of leaning against it on cold winter nights. Genevieve leaned toward Adriana with a conspirator's grin. He's taking notes for our own house someday. We learn best from others' mistakes. Or steal the best ideas from others, Eric said, turning to face Darin as he squealed. No originality from Uncle Finn, I know. Oh, come here, Pookie. Genevieve scooped Darin out of his chair. How's my boy? Resting on her hip, Darin took a handful of blonde curls into his hands and began to pull. Genevieve nuzzled her face into his, and as a grin split across Darin's face, he collapsed into her shoulder in a snuggly sort of hug. Oh, thank you. Genevieve squealed, hugging him close. In moments, Darin sat up, again entranced by her hair. To the others, she whispered, I just love him so much. I could kidnap him. Now Finn chortled. Don't get any ideas, especially in present company. Adriana snorted. At least if Genevieve kidnapped him I would know she'd feed him. Eric's eyes flicked to Adriana, wondering at the comment and if there was a double meaning. But she was smiling, her green eyes alight with mischief as Genevieve kissed Darin's cheek before lowering him back into his chair. Well, you know what they say. Adriana said. Time waits for no man. Finn raised a brow. What does time have to do with anything? Smirking, she slowly turned toward him. Well, when kids get married, the next step. Okay, Finn interrupted, leaning forward and specifically avoiding Genevieve's gaze. Just because it's your anniversary. I'm just saying Genevieve looks good with a baby on her hip, that's all. Adriana said. You should give her one. Anna. Genevieve smothered her face with her hands, blushing from neck to hairline, despite her embarrassed giggles. Eric, for his part, couldn't help but think his wife was extremely naughty and hot at that moment, though his mind wasn't on his friend's relationship. It was on his and Adriana's, and subsequently what he could give her. He kinda wished they would leave soon. Ugh, look at these kids, Eric. So flushed with embarrassment. Perhaps we. How's your leg? Finn interrupted, a bit desperately. Eric's gaze shot to him, cutting through the haze taking over his brain. He'd have to ask Adriana what she'd been about to say later, because it was both concerning and thrilling, the potential for what was about to come out of that pretty mouth. My leg's fine. Why? We're taking a trip, Finn said. My dad said his leg was feeling alright, too. I'll assume there are no storms coming then. Where are you going? Braun, Genevieve said, finally lowering her hands. We have unfinished business. Finn nodded, albeit a bit stiffly. I wanted to show Jenny the proper way to ask the locals if it's safe to fly before taking off. Genevieve rolled her eyes, even as she tapped her fingers toward Darin. One time. It was one time. It only takes one time. Their words were light, but the tension wasn't lost on Eric or Adriana. He glanced between them, wondering at Genevieve's pursed lips. While they might have made up since last week's storm, it might be a while before Finn forgave her for getting lost in the storm. It was an honest mistake, Eric thought. Any new rider might have made it. But because it was Finn and Genevieve, he understood. The breakup had been painful. If Genevieve had died. Memories of the last sudden death in the Haddock household came to mind and Eric shook his head. Not a pleasant thought. And Genevieve was fine, besides. There was no use focusing on the what-ifs when she'd made it to Burke with Max, who'd also healed up in a matter of days, and Finn had found them before the worst could happen. Perhaps Finn needed that reminder though. To not hold it over Genevieve's head, lest it cause unnecessary tension. But Eric wouldn't be the one to say it. He had his own bitterness to deal with. When Finn and Genevieve had at last returned to the great hall holding hands, they'd all breathed a silent sigh of relief. Cliff's wasn't so silent. Taryn had hugged Genevieve tightly, overcome with relief that she was safe and that they'd fixed their relationship. Looking at them now, you almost couldn't tell anything had happened at all. Genevieve had stated plainly that there were no more secrets between them. And yet Eric still felt a bit off-kilter at the admission. As if forcing Finn to reveal his greatest shame had been no small affair. It had taken a few days for Eric to reconcile himself to the frustration. Finn had found it in himself to forgive her somehow. Maybe because he'd truly changed or because he was stupidly in love with her. Maybe both. Regardless, Eric was frustrated for his friend, his brother, who deserved better than that. Adriana must have noticed his dark thoughts because her foot rested against his beneath the table. He noticed then how quiet the house had become. Finn cleared his throat. Well, we should get going if we plan to get back in time for dinner. Genevieve nodded and stood. We'll see you guys later. Thanks for coming. Adriana showed them to the door, watching as left. The chilled winter air flooded the room until at last the door closed, returning the house to silence. It was a few minutes before Eric looked up at Adriana and found her scowling. What? You know what? Eric frowned. What did I do? It's what you didn't do. Or maybe it is what you did. Depends on how you look at it, I guess. Elaborate, please. You ignored Genevieve the entire time she was here. No, Eric finished in a huff. Not on purpose. Maybe not. Adriana returned to her seat beside him. But she definitely noticed. She's not as good at reading minds as you. You always talk to her when she comes over, Adriana insisted. And while you were stubbornly avoiding her gaze, she kept trying to catch your eye. Just like you're ignoring mine right now. Eric turned his eyes toward her then, feeling a touch defiant. To her credit, she didn't wither or even flinch. What I don't understand, Adriana said, is why you're bitter and upset when you're not the one she even hurt. You don't think he deserved better? Of course, I did. In fact, I was the one who went to Jet and talked some sense into her. You were the one who told me to stay out of it, in fact. And now you've changed your mind. Now that Finn has forgiven her, you can't even look her in the eye. Eric worked his jaw, trying to work his emotions into words. I don't know. Did he forgive her too easily? Did he give her the benefit of the doubt? Did she make him false promises? What heartstrings did she pull to get him to back down so easily? Adriana waited until his tirade ended, until he took a deep breath to cool the frustration burning his lungs. You're angry for Finn. You don't want her to take advantage of him. No. Do you honestly think he could take another heartbreak like that? Finn's stronger than you think. Really? Because he was getting pretty far into his cups. Adriana huffed. He forgave her. That should be good enough. It's not. Eric insisted. Listen, I'm not saying that I'm unhappy they got back together. I was relieved when things worked out. But the way they're acting like nothing happened. How do you want them to act, Eric? They're trying to move on. Maybe. But at the end of the day, she wasn't here. She's the one who broke his heart, and we were the ones trying to pick up the pieces. And I'm afraid that she said and did whatever it took to win him back, and that it will happen again. They were silent for a few moments while Eric stewed in his thoughts. Adriana slid a toy closer to Darren, who'd sat in silence. Then, Adriana's fingers gently cupped his chin and turned his face toward hers. I don't think that's what she's doing. I don't think she's taken advantage of him or said whatever manipulative thing she could think of to win him back. I think she truly realized how stupid and immature she'd been and risked her life, quite without meaning to, trying to fix things. I, for one, am glad that they were able to have a conversation without anyone else getting involved. Do we not know what was said? Yes. But do we need to know? No. Bottom line is, Finn is his own person. He's made mistakes and he doesn't always think straight when he's emotional. But forgiving Genevieve, I don't think that was one of them. Adriana pecked his cheek and stood. I need to change Darren and put him down for a nap. Eric nodded, his frustration ebbing away. She picked up Darren and went upstairs, leaving him alone with his thoughts. Until a black and white cat stepped into the room on silent feet with a pronounced meow. Sighing, he turned toward Mittens. What? Are you mad at me too? Mittens meowed again, an insistent sound as he coiled around Eric's leg beneath the table. Did you feed the cat? Adriana asked from upstairs. Yup. This fatty eats more than I do. Meow. Yeah. When Mittens meowed yet again, Eric sighed. Come here. Come on. A long pause and Eric groaned before looking under the table. The cat sat a few feet away, staring and waiting expectantly. Listen. Meow. It's not dinner time. Meow. I didn't ask Mittens. Would you shut him up? Eric sighed again and got up from his chair. Mittens streaked out from beneath the table and padded to the kitchen, looking over his fluffy shoulder to make sure Eric followed. I swear, Eric muttered, dropping a piece of fish into the cat's bowl a few moments later. You're worse than Cliff on snackage day. I won't tell him you said that. Adriana said, coming down the stairs sang Darren. Cliffy takes great pride in being the snackage king. She paused on the second to last step, standing nose to nose with him, and pursed her lips. I do hate it when you frown, Mr. Larson. Well, it is kinda your fault. No, that's your fault, Adriana said, pulling him closer by the collar. You need to let it go. Eric sighed through his nose. I know. It's not bad to care for Finn's feelings. But he's a big boy, he can handle himself. The same boy who handled Brandine and Ali and Gray at the convocation can surely handle his own girlfriend. Eric nodded. You're right. Adriana beamed. I know. Then she kissed him and wrapped her arms around his neck. I've had enough of talking about my brother on our anniversary. Eric said, sliding his hands around her curvy waist. And what exactly would you like to talk about? Well, I'd hoped there'd be less talking and more. Eric didn't let her finish. If she wanted ravishing, she certainly didn't have to ask twice. And he too had had quite enough of talking. Gods, he didn't want to do this. Not for the first time. Finn glanced over at Genevieve, whose eyes darted from place to place, positively glowing with excitement. She'd never been to Brawn before. Not that they were here for fun times, Finn thought grimly. Genevieve had insisted on this trip actually. Sure, she'd wanted to go on a trip, spend the day with him, but it wasn't about the trip. It was about finding Rain to apologize for their behavior. Granted, he knew he owed the girl an apology. He'd been harsh and blunt and took out his anger and frustration on her. He still reserved the thought that she shouldn't have meddled, but resigned himself to the simple fact that it hadn't been done out of malicious intent. When he thought about their history, the things left unsaid between them when he'd left Brawn all those years ago, the things he'd intended to do, well, it made sense that she'd worried and wondered all these years, just what had happened to the heir to Burke. If something bad had happened to him, she probably would have lived the rest of her life with guilt. She probably would have wondered if she could have done something different. So when she had the opportunity to seek him out, she'd taken it. To check in, see how he was doing. Nothing more, nothing less. At least, that's what she'd said, before he'd thrown it in her face. It was the story Genevieve was sticking to, which provided her with the excuse for them to take a trip to Brawn. Kill two birds with one stone, she'd said. Make it three. He never considered himself a bird before now, but he would almost rather die than have this conversation. Hey, Genevieve's voice called over the sound of the waves. Deep breath. It will be fine. Finn didn't bother arguing and merely nodded. He sure hoped so. Maybe it was worth it, just to see that smile again. Genevieve had never been to Brawn before. As it loomed on the horizon like a dark shadow, she'd spurred Max into faster flight, forcing Zack to pump her wings harder to keep up. Now as they skimmed the rooftops of the sprawling village that stretched for miles, Genevieve's smile had yet to falter. Finn observed the town as they flew, raising a hand to those that waved. He wondered how many of them had been at the convocation, how many would recognize him. He'd worn nondescript clothing and a heavy hooded cloak, hoping that as they walked the streets they wouldn't be bombarded with a crowd. He had a few things to give Kara the Kind, chief of Brawn, from his father, but other than that and their pending conversation with Rain, he didn't want to linger. Still, he couldn't help but admire the massive village. He'd read of highly populated villages on the continent, called cities. He'd never been to one himself and knew the idea fascinated his father, just as it did Genevieve. The thought of a massive gathering of people that lived together, a hub of culture and people groups and animals, so big that it would put the convocation to shame, made Finn's head spin. Maybe a small part of him filled with wanderlust. Maybe someday he and Genevieve could take a long trip and explore, but that would be weeks, if not months of travel. He kept his mouth shut on the idea. With his luck, Genevieve would never let it go once he planted it in her head. He was happy to bring her to Brawn though. Brawn was close to home and they wouldn't miss Ben the baker's homemade pot pie for dinner if they made this quick. They steered Zap and Max to a series of tall buildings, which Finn knew to be the barracks. People moved through the streets while dragons flew overhead, landing in a series of platforms within the building. A full-functioning barracks for dragon and rider, all in one place. Finn hummed with interest, and made a mental note to mention it to his father. Hopefully Kara wouldn't mind the stolen idea. The chief had an office inside the barracks. He wasn't sure if Kara would be inside as they landed, kicking up dust from the wide street, but opted to leave the paperwork from his father on the desk there. He'd send a messenger if possible. Genevieve dismounted, barely noticing the wind as it blustered off the nearby shore. This place is huge. Isn't it? Brawn easily has twice our population, which makes their army as large and formidable as our own. Genevieve pulled a map out of her pocket and shook it open. So we're here, and Berserker. Finn pointed to a spot on the map to the northeast of their location. Not far. Probably makes family trips convenient for Sven and Kara. I'll say. Genevieve pursed her lips, then lifted her eyes toward his. Why did Sven take Berserker? Or rather, why Sven? Finn pulled the hood up on his cloak when a small crowd of workers turned the corner. He helped my father train before the duel with Dager the Deranged. He's a good guy, calm and collected. He shrugged. I guess my dad saw potential. So what would happen if either Kara or Sven passed away? Would the other get the land? Gods, Finn pulled her off the street and into a dark alcove. Don't say stuff like that. I'm not plotting an assassination. I'm just curious. The title would probably stay in their family's name. I mean, Sven has kids, Kara has kids. They're individual families. But what if? Don't be morbid. Shoving the map back in her pocket, Genevieve rolled her dark eyes. I just find these things interesting, that's all. Lineage, heirs to the thrones of all the tribes. It's fascinating. And dangerous, Finn said quietly. At her pursed lips, he sighed. Sorry. I'm not trying to nitpick you, my dad's worried, that's all. Worried? About what? About Brandine and Ali and Grey. What they're up to. Well, Grey's probably, what was it? Genevieve brought a hand to her chin. Sitting behind the safe walls of his plush mansion on the hillside. Ah, there's that smile. Finn shook his head. It's a wonder he hasn't put a bounty on my head just for that. Right. But we haven't heard from them in months. What's he worried about? It's my dad. He just worries. Silence plays its own role in the game, or so he says. Finn sighed, dropping his gaze to his hands. It's almost been a year. There's too much at stake, and he's afraid that if he lets his guard down, even for a minute, that's when he'll get stabbed in the back. Hey, Genevieve pressed her hands to his face. Concern was written all over her face. It's going to be okay. I know we don't have all the answers, but we can't let the fear of the unknown rule our lives. I know, Finn said, dropping his forehead onto hers. I'm just worried about him, that's all, and he's worried about us. Adriana and Eric are stuck in the honeymoon phase as if nothing's wrong, but we haven't stopped watching and waiting. It's not over. Genevieve nodded. I know. But you can't blame them for letting their guard down. And who knows, maybe they haven't, but they are happy. They are happy, Finn. They are well protected on Burke, so long as we don't get lazy. She shrugged and huffed a dark laugh. And who knows, maybe an accident will happen and Brandine won't be a problem any longer. Finn flicked his eyes up to meet hers and smiled. I forgot how dark you can be sometimes. Genevieve shrugged. It would make things easier, wouldn't it? Sighing, Finn kissed her forehead. Yeah. He glanced down the street at all the passers-by and pushed aside his worries and fears. One thing at a time. Then, as if the wind had called her name, a familiar girl with a dark braid stepped into the street, clad in light armor and followed by an entourage of guards. She held a clipboard in her hand and seemed to be taking notes. Rain. Finn sighed. Well, princess, are you ready? Genevieve had also noted her arrival, but kept her eyes level on his face. Finn looked down questioningly. Slowly, as if every movement mattered, Genevieve rose up on tiptoes and kissed him softly, slowly. It was so different from their usual kisses, so gentle, and yet claiming all the same. Reminding him why they were there and why they weren't. Not to prove a point, but to make amends. Whenever you are, Genevieve whispered. Finn brushed a curl off her brow and then turned down the street after Rain. It took a minute to find her in the bustling crowd, but he caught a glimpse of her dark braid amid a sea of armor, and quickened his pace. Genevieve kept close to his side. Their dragons remained behind, obeying orders to stay put. Finn didn't know how long it would take to find their dragons in this massive village and, well, pot pie was on the cards tonight if they played said cards right. Rain. The group of Brawnian guards paused when she did, the men frowning at the two cloaked figures approaching. One set a hand on the pommel of his sword at his waist, but Rain set a hand on his arm. She cocked her head, glancing down at Finn's and Genevieve's unadorned clothing, but understanding flooded her eyes. Ah yes, our appointment. Follow me. Rain, the guard beside her, murmured, but she gave him a firm look. Finn wasn't sure how much control she had over the soldiers, but the look seemed to soothe the man's ruffled feathers. Each of you to your stations. You have your orders. Rain said firmly, then turned to Finn and Genevieve. Follow me. They followed Rain into the building, ignoring the terse expression of the soldier as they left him with his troop. Rain strode down a long hallway, scribbling notes onto her clipboard as the combined sound of their boots hitting the floor sent an echo down the hall. More guards brushed past them, ignoring them completely. Finn blinked in amazement at the size of the barracks, even as Rain opened a door and waved them inside. What a pleasant surprise, Rain said, closing the door. Her blue eyes flicked nervously between them as they removed their hoods. She blinked and began stacking papers on her desk. I'm sorry, I usually keep this place more tidy. No, it's fine, Genevieve said quickly. We wanted to talk to you. Sorry for the secrecy, but, well, someone doesn't want to get swarmed by all his new fans. Rain gave them a knowing smile. Yes, the Brawnian guards are quite fond of Finn's exploits, as well as the people in general. Oh, please sit. I understand though. We all have things to do and don't have time to waste. She paused for only a moment before clasping her hands tightly, betraying her nerves. Well, what can I do for you? Genevieve glanced at Finn, who'd yet to speak. Well. Oh, well, before I forget, Finn withdrew a stack of papers from his breast pocket, sealed in red wax with his father's crest, AHH surrounded by the Night Fury symbol. From my father. Can you give this to Chief Kara for me? I'm sure you're not the right person. Oh yes, of course. I have meetings with her daily. Rain accepted the note and slid it into a folder. I'm practically her secretary. Really? Genevieve asked. That's amazing. I thought you were the coordinator for the guards. Well yes, it started that way, but I have recently accepted a promotion. The mess is, Well, a sign of my transition. Rain giggled, pushing a few stray hairs out of her eyes, which flicked to Finn. It's a long way from a tavern, huh? Finn met her eyes and saw it then. The understanding, the apology. Rain. Finn cleared his throat. We're here to apologize. I overreacted because I was upset, and... He sighed, hating the flush that rose up his neck in embarrassment and shame. I blamed you for a long time for everything that happened between us, and I was plenty responsible. And I was so obsessed with being perfect in my relationship with Jen that I was never honest with her or even myself about it. As difficult as it was, Finn forced himself to meet Rain's eyes again. So I'm sorry for any hurt I've caused you. I shouldn't have lashed out at you. I'm sorry as well, Genevieve said. We didn't speak much, but I was already upset about some things, and I was very rude. I made you uncomfortable and it wasn't right. Rain nodded at Genevieve's words. That's quite all right, she said softly. Any girl would wonder who the other girl was. Her blue eyes flicked to Finn, and softened. I'm sorry, too. I had no way of knowing that getting involved would cause so much heartache. I had no idea that, well, I suppose I never thought about it from your perspective. I truly wondered the last few years what became of you. You were in such a dark place when you left, and I felt wretched that I'd made you feel worse. It wasn't just you. I was angry at myself for stooping so low. Finn winced. Ah, sorry. Rain gave him a patient smile. I know what you mean. You were already hurting, and I made things worse. We were both at fault. Rain reached across the desk and outstretched a hand. What do you say we forgive and forget? Then we can be friends again, just as it should have been all along. Despite himself, Finn's eyes burned. He'd dreaded this conversation since the moment Genevieve mentioned it. He'd never thought that such a conversation would happen. For so long he'd hated himself, chided himself for the sins of his past, and held Rain responsible for so much of his angst with relationships. He was just as responsible for those poor choices as she was. And here she was, kindly accepting his apology, and requesting friendship. Nothing more. Nothing less. Smiling gently, Finn reached out and took her hand, and gave it a firm squeeze. She squeezed back, her face stretching into a bright smile, even as a few tears slipped down her cheeks. Relief spread through his chest as finally, after 3 long years, the burden slipped off his shoulders. He exhaled, and let it go. All was quiet in the Larson house. With Darren down for a nap, Adriana thought it prudent to lie down herself for a bit before she lost the opportunity. Eric had plans for their first anniversary, just as she did. He'd alluded to a babysitter and a nice dinner alone, maybe a stroll through the hills. She wasn't sure if he had a specific schedule, or if they'd play it by ear. But she hadn't missed the lingering looks, the subtle desire on his face all morning. So she wasn't surprised when after only a few minutes of dozing beneath the covers, she was bombarded by Eric sliding in beside her. What are you doing? Well, any proper man wants to spend his anniversary with his wife, and yet she decides to take a nap instead, Eric said. So I thought I'd join you. Good. It's chilly in here. Eric tucked her in close. We'll have to get some more furniture in here to fill up the empty space. Maybe that will help the room to stay warmer. Or we could tear out that empty wall and put in another fireplace. I just finished that wall. Kidding, kidding. Eric shook his head, muttering under his breath. Grinning, she pinched his waist and held fast when he flinched. Ticklish boy. And what, pray tell, are you grinning about? I thought you were supposed to be sleeping. Well, I was trying until this oaf attacked me in bed. Oaf, huh? Eric raised his brows. Sounds treacherous. Nah, he's pretty harmless. Adriana sat up. He's pretty cute with those blue-green eyes of his, but quite mischievous when he wants to be. Better lock the doors from now on. I can't have you stolen away by this oaf. Too late, she whispered and kissed him. Eric inhaled like he was breathing her and slid his hands around her waist. Needy, too. Eric mouthed the space below her ear. Only for you. Adriana squirmed away, fighting against the ticklish sensation. Stop, you haven't shaved today. 2 days actually, and I thought you liked it. Ever heard of chafing? Adriana rubbed a hand against his cheek and he pulled away. Doesn't feel nice, does it? Fine, fine. Eric gave a playful sigh. I shall resist the sensitive skin, even though it's my weakness. Though she shook her head, Adriana couldn't resist the wild grin. She tried distracting herself with the buttons on his shirt, but she couldn't hide from those probing eyes. So what exactly are you grinning about? I'm just, really happy. She met his eyes and saw nothing but happiness reflected back. I could stay like this forever. Eric swept a thumb across her brow, brushing aside her thick curtain of hair. Me too. You, me and Darren forever. Adriana kissed his wrist. What more could we want? Something flickered in his eyes, but he smiled. Yeah. Adriana raised a brow. Now, no secrets. Tell me. He paused, even as his fingers trailed down the sleeve of her shirt, and to her surprise, he looked a little nervous. I don't know how to put it into words. It's okay. Take your time. Adriana watched him think, felt the way the pads of his fingers trailed her skin, slowly, intently. After nearly a minute of silence, he exhaled in frustration, likely because he was thinking himself into circles. Have you? The question was there, Adriana realized. But he was afraid to ask it. Hey. Adriana tapped his chin until his teal eyes met hers. It's okay. Whatever it is, just say it. I want to have more kids. Of all the things she'd thought of, she hadn't considered that. Eric's head dropped back into his pillow with a heavy sigh. I know, it sounds selfish. No. Not at all. You just had Darren a few months ago. That's not fair to you. Hang on. Adriana propped herself up on both elbows. Why isn't it fair? He looked affronted by the question. I would have thought that was obvious. I don't want to. What? Force a kid on me like he did. The light-heartedness in his expression disappeared and he looked away. Sorry, that was too blunt. Adriana said, lightening her tone. You really want more? His eyes met hers again. Yes. I didn't realize it for a while, but, yeah. And even though it sucks to admit it, you're right. I don't want to force anything on you, not until you're ready. I had no idea. Adriana exhaled, trying to clear her thoughts. First of all, this is not a bad thing, Eric. I'm quite pleased to hear you say it actually. One side of his mouth quirked. Yeah. Yeah. Adriana grinned and, leaning closer, added, because if you hadn't noticed, I quite like you. Eric laughed, those dimples she loved finally appearing. And I quite like the idea of little Eric's and Adriana's running wild through the house. The smile on his face spoke volumes. Me too. Then, that smile faded. But I don't. Well, realistically it's not exactly a switch we can turn on. Well, Adriana gave him a rogue smile. Not conceiving, anyway. There's a switch for other things, of course. Eric snorted. Naughty girl. But Eric. Adriana's amusement faded. You're nothing like him. Everything about our relationship, our son, even this house proves it. There is nothing wrong with wanting to have kids with me. You wouldn't be forcing it on me. But what if you're not ready? Eric asked. You weren't prepared for it last time. Last time was different. Adriana said firmly. This time is different. I'm just saying, you don't have to feel guilty about admitting your feelings. We always talked about having kids anyway. We never planned on only having Darren. Right. Eric said quietly. What? I'm just afraid of being selfish. Like I'm not grateful for what I have or something. We already have one great kid, and, well, anything could happen. Why do I want to risk bringing more kids into the world when we don't know what could happen? That's life, babe. You know what I mean. I know you're referring to Brandine and everything else, but it's almost been a year. We've heard nothing. That doesn't mean anything, Annie. He won't give up until he gets what he wants, whatever that is. My point exactly. Adriana said. There is no reason for us to put our lives and our happiness and our family on hold because he is a psycho. Eric sighed. I know. His hand was warm as it slid up her arm, the calluses of his skin rough and stained from dye. I'm just worried about us, Annie. I feel I'm caught in this trap where I want so much and can't let myself even dream of it for fear that it will all come crashing down. The tone of his voice, the way his fingers trailed up her neck to cup her jaw, it sent a pang of sadness through her. It wasn't possession or lust. It was fear. Adriana clutched his wrist. Eric, it's going to be okay. I don't want to lose you or Darren. You won't, Adriana whispered, pressing her hands to his face and kissing him firmly. I'm right here. I'm not going anywhere. He swallowed and slid his hands around her back, holding her close while he fought to control his emotions. Adriana kissed his forehead and stroked his hair, surprised by his emotion. She hadn't realized just how afraid he'd become. Sometimes she forgot about Brandine and the threats he'd left with them. The normalcy of life had taken over, being a wife and a mother, and there were times that it felt like Brandine had never happened. It felt like Eric was Darren's biological father. That was how normal and safe it had become. But Eric hadn't forgotten. He'd made sacrifices for her and Darren, which was why he worked so hard. He surely didn't regret those sacrifices. But while they remained in Brandine's shadow, he was afraid to have more for fear of losing it. And he was afraid that by admitting his wants and desires that he would be overstepping some boundary with her. Well, regardless of wants and desires, she easily could have become pregnant again at any time this past year. Such were their habits. She hated that he felt that way. That if she got pregnant before she was ready, that he'd somehow hurt her. As if the thought of carrying his child was something she wouldn't want. As if the decision was only hers to make. Adriana lifted her face. Listen to me, okay? I know it's hard, but forget about Brandine. As far as our family is concerned, we are the ones who decide. We picked the land. We picked the building materials. We built the house. And way before that, we chose our son. Brandine has no say in what happens in our life. She paused until he nodded, and then gentled her voice. And if the gods bless us with more kids, either now or later, I will never look at you with disdain, as if it's something I didn't want, because we chose this together. Like we do for everything. She smoothed a hand across his jaw. Don't let him rule your life, Eric, as I once did. Slowly, Eric nodded. Some of the tension eased from his shoulders, though there was still some reservation in his eyes. So? Adriana sat up on her elbows, eyebrows raised. Well, if you need specific, detailed permission to put a kid inside me. Adriana. Eric said, flopping back into his pillow again. Adriana cackled, collapsing beside him and snuggling into his chest. I do love embarrassing you. He turned his head, expression amused. Embarrassed? Who said anything about embarrassed? Surprised maybe, but he sat up then and loomed over her, a wicked smile on his face. Oh gods. Embarrassed? Surely not. Adriana swallowed. Well, poor choice of words, apparently. I'll do better next time. His smile softened. Seriously though? Do you want more yet? Because we can wait. Darren's not even one yet. Adriana leaned up on her elbows and pecked his lips. I stand by what I said. If the gods bless us with another. Yes, you said you wouldn't look at me with disdain, but that's not the same as wanting. What I want is you, Eric Larson, Adriana whispered. I love you. And I'd be honored to have more babies with you. As many as you want. Though his teal eyes flared at that, sending a thrill through her, he still swallowed. Do you mean it? Adriana smiled and kissed him, deepening the kiss and pulling him atop of her. He kept his eyes on hers as his hands roamed, his mouth slid across her lips, down her neck. Soon the room felt hot and all she could think was that she wanted more. Annie. Yes. The word an answer and a plea. Yes, she wanted more. Yes, she wanted him. Yes, she wanted another. Yes, she wanted his baby. Yes, yes, yes. Their breath was heavy in her ears, his skin soft against hers the moment she'd pulled his shirt over his head and thrown it across the room. Adriana clutched his face firmly in her hands. "Give me everything you've got." And everything he gave, she matched. Somehow after a year, it was like the first time all over again, but this time there was no fumbling, no confusion. It was fast and hot, until she saw stars, until her lips were chapped and he seized atop her with a groan that she felt in every part of her. When it was over, their hearts raced in tandem. Eric tried to sit up, but his arms buckled. Adriana planted a hand on his back, and said in a hoarse voice, "Stay." Phew. They'd had some passionate nights but that was, well. "You've been holding out on me, Mr. Larson." Unsure if he'd hear her, she was surprised when he laughed. He slowly sat up and nuzzled her face. "Well, I do what I can, Mrs. Larson." Adriana giggled. Eric scooped her up in his arms and turned them so that she was once again on his chest. She sighed and suddenly felt distinctly drowsy. Eric sighed and brushed a hand through her hair. "Sleep. Before Darren wakes up." Home. She should check on Darren before falling asleep, but she couldn't bring herself to move. She was warm and comfortable, and Eric's fingers trailing through her hair felt nice. It wasn't long before she slipped into a deep sleep, her mind filled with a future with her beloved husband, surrounded by a brood of blue and green-eyed children. Hiccup squinted in the darkness of his workroom, twisting the wrench. It creaked in the silence, the only sound aside from his breathing and the occasional squeak of his prosthetic. The candle guttered with the slight draft, the orange glow flickering across the walls. Filled with bookshelves and desks and an endless number of projects, this was his sanctuary away from home. Here he worked on inventions, projects he'd wanted to fiddle with or perfect, or even tinker with his prosthetic leg. It was here that he'd built Eric's own prosthetic leg. And yet, of all the projects, he still hadn't found time to fix the cracks in the roof where the cold wind slipped in. He didn't mind the chill. It kept him awake, in fact, despite the late hour and the strain of fatigue in his eyes. With all luck though, this project would be complete within the hour. It was worse when it rained, when after hours of a heavy downpour he'd remember the cracks, and he'd sprint to the room to find it flooded. Notebooks ruined, sketches and plans drenched, black ink spider webbing across parchment in waves, and sometimes in the worst cases, valuable materials lost to the elements. Leather, metal that would rust, even furniture. These things could be replaced, of course. It wasn't the end of the world. Obviously if the weather damage bothered him that much, he'd have fixed the roof by now. Still, he couldn't help but feel like this workroom was symbolic of his life. He was the building. His heart was filled with all manners of important things, his family, his dragon, his people, their homeland of Burke, his friends and their homes across the sea, his people's freedom, the archipelago. Yet there were cracks in the ceiling. The rains were flooding in. There was so much that could be lost. There were too many holes, too many weak spots that could take damage, would take damage. And no matter how hard he tried, how much he obsessed about fixing the cracks, he was always looking the other way. That's when the weather would hit the strongest. The moment he wasn't looking, that's when they would strike. Sighing, Hiccup dropped the tools with a clatter and shoved his hands into his hair. He knew he should be sleeping, not spending half his nights out here stressing about all the what-ifs, but sleep had been evading him for weeks now. He didn't think his kids had noticed, distracted as they were with their own lives, but Astrid and their closest friends had. He couldn't help it. Maybe life had conditioned him to be afraid, to always look over his shoulder, to always wonder when the knife would stab him in the back or from which direction it would come. He had allies and friends on all sides, but doubt had crept in a long time ago. His enemy had gotten close. Too close. Brandine had planned on taking his precious daughter away from him. Thank the blessed gods that she'd stood her ground and fought back for herself, her home and family. And Brandine had nearly taken Finn from him too, in that cursed duel. It had been 8 months since they'd last seen Brandine and Ali and Grey. 8 months and not a word from any one of them. No suspicious activity from their neighboring territories either. The calm before the storm. As much as he dreaded the storm, the waiting was worse. That old familiar fear that came with memory, from knowing what that sort of turbulence felt like and trying to prepare for the next hit, but unsure if you were properly prepared. If the next wave would make you drown. He wanted to be ready. No, he had to be ready. For his people, for his wife, for his kids, for his grandson, he had to be ready. A feeling of anxiety rose in him like a wave, making his breath hitch for a moment, before he let out a slow breath through his mouth. He breathed in again through his nose, and out through his mouth again. Behind him, the door opened. A soft wind blustered through the room, buffeting the candle for a moment before the door closed. Soft yet firm footsteps sounded, but Hiccup didn't raise his head. The sound of a chair pulling up beside him filled the room, and then she sat beside him, resting a hand on his shoulder. "Hey," Astrid said softly. "It's nearly 3 in the morning. What are you still doing out here?" She knew the answer, of course. Nothing ever got past her, his beautiful, intelligent wife, who was his better half in every way. The thought only made his throat close up. Her hand tightened on his shoulder when he didn't move or speak. Hiccup. Slowly, he dragged his hands down his face. "I don't know anymore, Astrid." Not the answer she wanted, judging by the way her fingers tightened on his arm. Still, her words were gentle, as if she knew that by getting upset or forceful, it would make things worse. "What do you mean?" Hiccup rubbed his eyes until he saw spots. The turbulent thoughts in his heart and mind had only been swirling for weeks, if not months, and it seemed that it was all coming to a head. She seemed to know it, too. "You're worried," Astrid said, brushing her fingers through his hair. "You're worried about me and the kids and Burke, and if I know you, you're probably worried about the archipelago. You're thinking too much about what could happen when in fact, everything is fine." "Everything is not fine." Hiccup snapped, dropping his hands at last. "It's only a matter of time before something happens, like Ali sending her armies to attack or Grey sending the slave traders our way, and then what are we going to do, Astrid? We only have so many warriors, even with our dragons we can't fight that many battles at once." "Hiccup, stop," Astrid said firmly. "You don't know that. Nobody knows the future, but right now everyone is safe. There is no use wearing yourself thin like this when you should be resting now, preparing now." "How do I prepare for the worst that could happen?" Hiccup demanded, feeling the threads of his emotions fraying by the second. "And I can't rest, not while I know Brandine is out there scheming." Astrid shook her head. "You never stressed like this when Dager was around." "The arrogance of a child," Hiccup said. "I hardly had anything to lose then. Now I stand to lose everything." His breath hitched on the word and he looked away, not wanting her to see the anxiety eating away at him. Even though she knew it was there, as it had been for years. But now it had been given something to feed on, like yeast to warm water. They were quiet for some time. Despite everything he was feeling, it was nice. Just to have her there, sitting with him. He'd spent too many nights in this room alone. Of course, he could spend that time in bed with her while she slept, but at least here he was productive, getting things done with his hands, rather than listening to her breathe and wondering how many breaths she had left in this life. If they would grow short in number because of his choices. Astrid set a cold hand on his jaw, cutting through his thoughts. She'd taken off her kransen for the night. Half of her hair was tied back in a braid while the rest hung down straight. In the low light, her expression was firm but also gentle. There are good responses and bad responses to stress. This, she set a hand on the mass of black leather and screws before him, is good. It's being prepared should the worst happen. It's giving our kids a fighting chance if something should happen to you. But the bad is making that assumption. There's no guarantee that he's even coming back, Hiccup. If we're lucky, Brandine will disappear, and we'll never see him again. That's wishful thinking, Astrid. Maybe, she said, her eyes firm. But it's better than acting like a dead man walking. I don't want you to waste what time you have with your family today because you're afraid of losing them tomorrow. Let tomorrow handle itself. Today we will prepare, today we will spend time with our son and daughter and grandson. We will have Darren's first snoggletog and see his first birthday soon enough, and more. You want that, don't you? Tears slipped down his face as he nodded. Gods, yes. To see his children grow, his grandchildren grow, that's all he'd ever wanted. Then let's take every day as it is, Astrid said, swiping his cheeks. This world is filled with evil people, hiccup, but life is still worth living. Don't let it go to waste by stressing it away. Nodding, Hiccup slipped his arms around her waist and dropped his face into her neck. I'm sorry. No, Astrid said, squeezing his shoulders. Don't apologize. After everything we've been through, you never have to apologize to me for having emotions, Hiccup. We crossed that bridge a long time ago. Yeah, because of Dager, Hiccup thought dully. He pulled away and wiped his face. Still, I've been reclusive. I'm sorry for that. Astrid straightened his collar. Cold nights build character. Hiccup snorted. Sounds like something Finn would say. And he'd be right. Hiccup took her hand and gave it a squeeze. Thank you. I would have been lost years ago if it wasn't for you. After a moment of consideration, wondering at her own tired eyes, he asked, How are you doing? She sat back in her chair, still holding his hand. Oh, tired, trying to stay on top of lessons and my shift on the guard. I'm watching Darren tomorrow afternoon, too, so Adriana can go to Taryn's bridal shower. There's so much to do, as always. It never ends, does it? Life would be dull without it. Hiccup nodded. So Astrid nodded toward the desk in front of them. Is it ready? He sat up and lifted the tail fin, observing the gears as it opened and closed. I believe so. It needs a fresh paint job and some heat to make it last, and I probably should give it a test run, if Toothless will allow it, that is. And I made a few extra calibrations to give it extra strength, but it's what? Astrid shook her head, grinning. You're rambling. She leaned forward and kissed him firmly. Most days you talk too much, Haddock, but lately you've been too quiet. Ah, so you find my ramblings endearing. It was annoying at first, but I admit it's grown on me. Ha ha, Hiccup said dryly, setting the tail back down on the table. Anyway, yes, it should work. It's only for precautions. Where will you hide it? Hiccup shrugged. I haven't gotten that far yet. Hopefully we won't need it. But I'll tell each of the kids where to find it. You never know if something. Yes, well, Astrid abruptly stood, cutting off his dark thoughts before they could begin. He looked up at her in surprise, then stiffened when she straddled his waist and sat in his lap. I believe we get the picture. Hiccup swallowed. Do we? Yes, and do you know what I think? No, but I'd be very interested to find out, Astrid. I think it's cold in here, Haddock. Astrid whispered, dragging her fingers through his hair enough to make tingles shoot down his spine. His fingers contracted against her hips instinctively, and suddenly he couldn't look away from those blue eyes even if he wanted to. So the question is, are you going to warm me up in here, or back in the house? Hiccup's mouth went dry. Well, seeing as we have a kid in said house, I don't think he'd appreciate the noise. Noise? Astrid bit her lip and pressed every inch of her body into his. I like the way you think, Haddock. Gods, would you quit calling me that? Hiccup choked on a laugh. Why? What would you like me to call you? Astrid asked, pecking his lips. Hiccup. She kissed his jaw. Sir. Sir. Really, Astrid? How about Chief? She whispered in his ear. Hiccup cleared his throat. I take it back. Haddock is fine. Astrid laughed, but he ended the sound in a kiss. After Toothless, she was irrevocably the best thing that had ever happened to him. First her, and then his kids. And as always, she was right. She could cut through his emotions like a scythe, and remind him of the good parts of life. He'd spent so much time dwelling on his fears and stress, and he'd miss the most important thing standing in front of him. He'd truly, truly be lost without her. She was his anchor, his right arm, his better half. And he loved her. More than anything. Chapter 7, Snoggletog Face Off. Chapter Text. For Alton Brand, there was nothing better than the sound of the waves lapping against the hull of a ship. Combined with the sound of seagulls squawking overhead and the salty scent of sea spray in the air, it was his Valhalla. If he could live his entire life at sea and never set foot on land again, he'd be happy. He'd miss his family, of course, and all the other benefits of home. Home-cooked meals, dragons, his family, his friends, including a certain dark-haired, blue-eyed girl. Burke would always be home, but out here with nothing but the wind and the sky and the sea, this was where he was truly content. As a child, Alton had never fancied himself an adventurer or an explorer. He'd known very little of the outside world, let alone sailing or survival skills. Astrid's classes had been a good initiation for life skills, but he'd never had the opportunity to put them to use. He never thought he would either. But everything changed when his brother died. In light of the tragedy that had befallen his family, he'd grown more reckless, more restless, more frustrated as his parents' hold on him grew tighter and tighter, like a noose. Looking back, he understood why they'd held on so tightly. That fear of loss, that tightening of the leash, he understood. In time, he grew to forgive them. But the moment he'd heard trader Johann say that he could use an apprentice, a companion to travel with him and assist him with the trading business in his old age, he'd leapt at the opportunity. It had taken so much time convincing and begging his parents, and much promising on Johann's part that he could, in fact, keep a young man alive, he hadn't expected them to relent. Suddenly, he was free. He'd been filled with such excitement at the prospect of being on the open sea with very little rules. Johann was kind and generous, and talked more than necessary, but Alton didn't mind. He'd taken to sailing and fishing and hunting with ease. Soon calluses had formed on his hands from handling rope and oar alike, and his skin had tanned from long days in the sun. After months at sea, Alton had experienced nothing short of sheer terror and joy when he and Johann fought their way through an intrepid storm. As they crested the final waves that would send them rushing toward safety, Alton had wept for the first time in months, not out of fear or relief, but grief that had been buried far too long. Grief for the brother he'd lost, who would have laughed at the storm and challenged it with a fierce grin. Kurt had always been the adventurous one. That was why he and Aud Larsen had been such a good match. And in that moment on the high seas, fighting the wind and the rain and the waves, Alton remembered. No matter how far he ran, that grief was still there. Somehow, Alton grew up on the ocean's waves. He didn't just grow physically. He learned about life, about people. Nothing could have prepared him for the cultures he discovered on the outer reaches of the archipelago. The languages, the clothing, the skin colors, the food. Gods, the food. Burke was seriously missing out with its salty fish and crusty bread. He learned about finances, too. He learned how to run a business, how to haggle prices and tempt people to buy things. He learned how to read the stones and metal in jewelry, how to tell if something was real or fake. He learned about spices and expensive materials like silk and had meals with people who sold them. He learned about their homelands, hundreds of thousands of miles across the sea and across the mainland. Alton learned that the world was bigger than he'd ever imagined. It was wild and beautiful and full of amazing things and people. And, best of all, it was only a ship ride away. The thought of going home was always a pleasant one. He didn't get homesick often, but after a long stretch of travel, sometimes he'd see something to remind him. A dragon, a sword, a pair of blue eyes shining through a store window. He'd blink and realize it wasn't what he'd thought, and move on, but the feeling lingered. He missed Burke. He missed home with its tamed dragons and stubborn chorus of burly Vikings. He missed his family. He missed Inga. He shoved the thought away, but each day the thought grew stronger in his mind. His sister Taryn and Cliff were soon to be married in a few months' time. He and Johann would travel home for the wedding, of course. He'd have to be home a few weeks in advance, in fact, to get his clothes tailored and assist with decorations and practice for the ceremony. He'd be home soon. He could handle a few more months at sea and visiting ports. As always, time would fly like a night fury. So fast, it would be gone before you blinked. Still, the thought lingered. Alton lowered the tarp over his cart and tied it down, securing everything inside. The marketplace was heavily guarded, so he had no concerns of it being robbed. He didn't dare leave anything highly valuable behind. No, those items they kept on the ship. He nodded toward the nearest guard and strode down the cobbled street. The scent of meat and spices wafted through the air, making his stomach grumble, and he quickened his pace. He'd been in the market all day with hardly anything save a few apples. He was ready for a proper meal. "Here, lad," a fellow merchant called out. "I seen ya eyeing my valuables all day. Why don't ya take a peek-see before ya return to your ship, aye?" Alton gave the man a tight-lipped smile but shook his head. He didn't slow his pace as the man continued to call after him and was joined by a few others. He didn't need to get a close-up look of the man's valuables to know they were highly overpriced and had even less value. One cart did catch his eye, however. A woman with golden skin sat on an ornamented rug beneath an erected tent the color of wild berries. Her dark eyes noted his slight pause.